Have you ever envisioned witnessing the effectiveness of all your endeavors? Indeed, that's precisely what occurs to an individual weary of his mundane existence. Eventually, one day, unexpectedly, he acquires an extraordinary skill. He is capable of perceiving the prospects of achievement in any choice. Looking to allocate funds, he is already aware whether it will be effective. By leveraging that, he begins to transform his life entirely, transitioning from an unknown individual to an individual of immense strength, consistently selecting the optimal route and steering clear of any errors. Without any delay, let's dive into the video. A young man strolled dejectedly through the avenues after his landlord had evicted him and altered all the locks. Now, if he was unable to settle the rent, he might be forced to slumber on the pavement. To make matters worse, his latest book had flopped once more, leaving him without a dependable source of income from manuscript payments. His name was Bai Wu, a writer of the 18th rank, utterly unsuccessful, and his notable work was titled "Starting Today, I Nurture Slimes." He peered into his pockets, assessing how many meals he could still manage with the scant funds he had remaining. However, upon observing the sum he retained, he contemplated that perhaps he might have to clean dishes to endure. While strolling, he noticed a convenience store and contemplated that his existence had already reached its lowest point. Thus, purchasing a lottery ticket to test his fortune had become inconsequential. He inquired with the vendor for a 5 yuan scratch-off ticket. The merchant set several tickets on the counter and inquired which one he desired. The main character, feeling utterly despondent, remarked that he was merely testing his fortune, thus anyone would suffice. Yet unexpectedly, his sight started to fade small and several percentages began to materialize before him. Alarmed, he pondered what was occurring as his sight was somewhat hazy, but perhaps it was due to his all-night writing session the previous day. The merchant presented him with a voucher, and the percentage associated with it was 100%. Meanwhile, the main character remained unable to comprehend precisely what that was, pondering whether he alone could perceive it, or if it might merely be a figment of his imagination. Nonetheless, he concluded that he ought to purchase a ticket to verify. The moment he rubbed it, he earned 10 yuan. This filled him with enthusiasm, and he considered that perhaps it truly was what he had envisioned. He requested the vendor to provide him with 2 additional items and selected those with a 100% rating. Each of those 2 garnered him 50 yuan. The main character found it hard to fathom that the figures on the instant win tickets indicated the likelihood of triumph. Enthralled by this prospect, he requested the shopkeeper to provide him with an additional 11 scratch-off tickets. The storekeeper was somewhat taken aback by that demand. Bai Wu acquired a total of 10 tickets with a flawless success rate and 1 with none. He chose to commence with the option that had a 0% likelihood of success, and indeed, he did not achieve any victory. He was astonished to observe that he was genuinely able to discern the rate of success. The merchant chuckled and gave him a friendly tap on the shoulder, remarking that indulging in a bit of play was enjoyable, but excessive engagement could be detrimental to both body and mind, urging him to recognize when to cease while he was in a favorable position. Bai Wu tossed all his cash onto the table, requesting 10 20 yuan lottery tickets and a single 10 yuan ticket. The merchant was pleased as he thought he would claim all of the protagonist's funds. He grasped the tickets in his hand and inquired if he was truly certain he still wished to purchase them, cautioning that he ought not to squander the final 200 yuan in winnings he had secured previously. 10. Shortly thereafter, the shop owner executed a transfer of 20,420 yuan, pondering the nature of such ridiculous fortune. Bai Wu believed that the figures on the lottery slips indicated the likelihood of victory. However, the prize value was entirely uncertain. It would be beneficial if he could be aware of the prize sum prior to purchasing the ticket, for instance, the likelihood of achieving a victory of 100 or various other sums. The merchant remained perplexed about how such an abundance of fortune could be concentrated in one individual. Unexpectedly, the main character observed several details and requested the shopkeeper to provide him with a few additional no-mistake, no-hits, scratch-off tickets. The proportions this time shifted slightly. Certain tickets featured merely 10%, whereas others displayed 100%, 150%, or even 200%. The merchant went on to remark that the main character ought to cease while he was ahead, as fortune was genuinely capricious and could manifest or vanish in an instant. Bai Wu chuckled and remarked that it was acceptable, as he believed his fortune was quite favorable that day, and if he did not succeed, the shopkeeper could view it as a donation to the charitable cause. However, the shop owner was quite vexed, believing that the main character had merely struck a fortune of 20,000. Thus, he was genuinely curious to discover how long this stroke of good fortune would endure. Bai Wu selected an additional ticket with a 10% likelihood of victory, and upon scratching it, he discovered that he had triumphed. He chuckled, remarking that it appeared his fortune remained intact. The merchant grew increasingly exasperated with everything of this, as the main character character continued to scratch and triumph. However, the store owner recognized that there had already been 6 consecutive tickets, each of which had secured rewards. Thus, how could there exist an individual with such extraordinary fortune on this planet? The main character rubbed another lottery ticket and remarked that his fortune was exceptionally favorable that day, as he had just triumphed once more. He gazed at the remaining tickets still available for purchase, pondering whether he could ascertain the likelihood of securing 50 yuan. Abruptly, all the proportions that had previously been displayed underwent a significant transformation, and the main character rejoiced as this was precisely what he had anticipated. The abrupt level of achievement was a response, grounded in the inquiry he sought to understand at that time. Thus, as long as he modified the inquiries and applied the success rate accurately, he could flawlessly mislead the proprietor of that shop. Consequently, he could alter his own fate. Bai Wu gazed at the merchant and chuckled, remarking that judging by appearances, his fortune was indeed quite favorable. The merchant inquired whether he genuinely intended to convey merely excellent, for judging by appearances, it seemed he had amassed a considerable amount of positive karma in a previous existence. The main character chuckled, realizing that possessing that celestial relic was not merely about gathering positive karma from a previous existence. Bai Wu let out a warm chuckle and mentioned that his fortune was excellent. Thus he desired an additional 20 tickets. The store owner grew somewhat annoyed, informing the protagonist that fortune was indeed quite beneficial, but he ought not to become dependent on such matters. Bai Wu remarked that it was acceptable, as his fortune was exceptionally favorable that day. Perhaps those 20 tickets might also yield rewards. Even in the event of a loss, he had already succeeded in securing over 20,000, so it wouldn't significantly impact him. He set the ticket on the surface and grabbed a coin. The shopkeeper had already positioned his hand over his chest, bracing himself for a cardiac event. The main character commenced to scratch gradually, and the merchant observed each precise action. However, the moment the abrasion off was entirely scraped, the merchant exhaled a breath of relief, as the main character had not triumphed once more. He informed the young man that he had previously cautioned him, as fortune was capricious and inconsistent. Bai Wu believed that fortune was truly fickle, but there was something else that was. He swiftly proceeded to scrape all the remaining scratch cards there, and merely did not succeed in any of them. The merchant felt a sense of relief regarding the situation and remarked that he had previously cautioned the protagonist to stop while he was ahead, but the latter chose to ignore his advice. He surmised that the protagonist had likely exhausted all his fortune for the year by achieving consecutive victories at that moment. Bai Wu gazed at the leftover tickets and observed one with an exceptionally elevated ratio. He was amazed and grasped that ticket in his palm, contemplating that he truly did not rely on his fortune, but rather on the skill he had recently acquired, because he had intentionally purchased scratch-off tickets with a 0% success rate. This approach allowed him to scratch multiple tickets without securing any victories, thereby preventing any suspicion from arising due to excessive winnings. Thus, his defeats had been deliberate. The merchant proposed a deal, stating he would return 100 and forfeit the remainder, as given the protagonist's present fortune, securing at least one of those 10 tickets would already be quite favorable. However, the main character declined, expressing that it was unnecessary, yet he expressed gratitude for the generosity shown, as he had lost faith. Nonetheless, this was also a component of his strategy, for now it was the moment to alter circumstances. How could he merely allow that to slip by? The store owner stated that the main character was free to act as he wished, since he had attempted to caution him multiple times. Immediately after the main character revealed another scratch-off, he exclaimed, informing the shopkeeper that his fortune had resurfaced. The store owner glanced at the scratch card and remarked it was merely 10 yuan, but judging by the way Bai Wu yelled, it appeared to be 10,000. Bai Wu succeeded in securing victories multiple times in a row. Nevertheless, he felt somewhat disheartened, as the highest reward was merely 100. The shopkeeper was astonished, exclaiming that the lad was a remarkable anomaly. The main character concentrated, expressing to the celestial entity and the terrestrial entity that he genuinely desired that final ticket, hoping to secure a substantial reward exceeding 10,000. The storekeeper inquired whether he truly understood the scarcity of winning a substantial reward exceeding 10,000 on a scratch-off ticket. Bai Wu chuckled, retrieved the ticket he had kept for the finale, and informed the shopkeeper that he had just secured 15,000. By the looks of things, his fortune truly seemed to be transcending the ordinary. Once the shopkeeper handed him the 15,000 reward, Bai Wu inquired about what he had been mentioning earlier, something pertaining to a run of good luck. However, the shop owner claimed it was insignificant, all the while suspecting that something was amiss. All at once, he conceived an excellent notion and gazed at the tickets, contemplating that the probability of winning with scratch-off lottery tickets was predetermined at the time of printing. Given the protagonist's substantial winnings, the remaining tickets were likely nothing more than worthless. worthless. In an attempt to recoup some of his losses, the shopkeeper approached the protagonist, remarking on his astonishing luck, and inquired if he was interested in taking another minor gamble. He feared that if more customers arrived later to purchase additional tickets, only winning 1 or 2 out of every 10, it would severely impact his own business operations. Bai Wu inquired about the success rates of the leftover scratch-off tickets in the cabinet, at which point a new capability revealed the percentage for each ticket, with the majority hovering around 0%. Merely one approached 5%, and that fell short. Bai Wu advised the merchant that it would be prudent for him to cease, as that was likely the zenith of his fortune, and his prospects were bound to decline thereafter. Bai Wu believed that the lottery guidelines stipulated a 30% success rate for scratch-off tickets. However, despite all that, his chances would amount to merely 5%. The merchant continuously attempted to motivate the main character, asserting that he had already succeeded in earning over 35,000. So why should he not continue to seize the chance? Bai Wu elucidated that even if his losses were minimal, ranging from 200 to 300, it was still a financial setback, and individuals ought to be economical to ensure a prosperous future. The shopkeeper grew somewhat exasperated, as the protagonist had only recently begun to articulate these sentiments. Bai Wu informed the shopkeeper that he was fully aware of his benevolent motives. Nevertheless, he felt that satisfaction equated to joy. The main character believed that this time he had achieved an exceptionally substantial gain. Nevertheless, he contemplated whether his extraordinary ability could be applied in areas beyond just lottery tickets. Upon nearing the entrance, he inquired of the system regarding the likelihood of successfully unlocking the door. Once more, a system display emerged showcasing a 100% success rate, which indicated it truly functioned. However, abruptly, the percentage that had remained at 100% started to decline sharply, until it arrived at 0%. The main character felt a twinge of fear and stepped back from the entrance. Out of nowhere, a sturdy dog sprinted toward us and burst through the glass door. Bai Wu recognized that chance had aided him in evading a catastrophe, as that dog was exceedingly careless and had nearly knocked him down. The merchant who observed the entire scene was astonished and started contemplating how the main character foresaw the need to evade ahead of time. Before he could exit the shop, the storekeeper seized his arm, insisting that he must not even think of departing. Bai Wu was taken aback, believing that it was finished and that he had been apprehended. The store owner inquired about how he was aware. The main character believed that this was anticipated since his prior behaviors had been somewhat unusual. He inquired of his capability regarding the likelihood of triumph in duping the shopkeeper and feigning to be merely a fortune teller. The system alerted him that he had approximately a 50% likelihood. He opted to rephrase the inquiry, questioning if boasting that his lineage had inherited the craft of divination for centuries would elevate the odds. The system adjusted to 64%. He resolved to experiment with it and informed the shopkeeper that, in reality, he was a seer. Furthermore, he stated that he could not be mistaken for those con artists on street corners, as his family's heritage traced back to the Zhou dynasty, boasting a legacy of 2 to 3 millennia. The merchant suspected that he was likely deceiving him, inquiring whether it truly spanned 2 to 3 millennia. He underscored that he had a strong faith in science and dismissed the existence of phantoms or apparitions. Moreover, he remarked that if the main character's lineage had endured for 2 or 3 millennia, he ought to be renowned, assuming that was genuinely the case. The proportion that had once stood at 64% started to decline to 60%. The merchant inquired why he had never come across the main character. Bai Wu considered the container above the merchant's head to be a manifestation of divine influence. Thus, how could he solely place his faith in science? He persisted in recounting the same narrative, inhaled deeply, and clarified that his family had been transmitting this heritage, disclosing celestial revelations that attracted divine consequences. Thus, they refrained from intervening in significant transformations, which accounted for their lack of widespread recognition. The ratio started to increase once more, and the main character felt a sense of optimism as a result. He displayed the victorious tickets on the counter and informed the shopkeeper that he had previously observed his prophetic skills. The rate of achievement increased to 80%, and the merchant remarked that this was challenging, yet inquired whether that could genuinely be the cause of it. Bai Wu stated that was precisely it, highlighting that he had merely foretold his prosperity and affluence. The gains had all been assessed by him, yet he chose to cease due to the response from the skies. Thus, the 10 tickets he had failed to win were a portent. The proportion attained 90%. The merchant inquired whether that was indeed the case, as he had been pondering how Bai Wu managed to be fortunate enough to secure 2 substantial rewards consecutively on scratch-off tickets. The main character went on to express that as soon as he departed, he abruptly sensed something amiss and intuited that a violent calamity was imminent, prompting him to retreat. The storekeeper was ultimately persuaded and referred to the protagonist as master, inquiring about the cost of a fortune-telling, as he wished to have his fate assessed. Bai Wu considered this an excellent chance to evaluate the accuracy of his predictions. He chose to decline, stating that it was preferable to overlook that issue as his ancestry highlighted fate and consequences. He had just foreseen his own monetary prospects, which would influence his enterprise in the future. Each action had a reaction, and he inquired of the merchant what precisely he desired the main character to foresee. The merchant underscored his earnest desire for his new master to attempt to ascertain his fortune and prosperity, as his former hometown was facing destruction, yet compensation had yet to be settled. Consequently, he sought to inquire of the protagonist how much the opposing side might concede if he were to present a proposal. Bai Wu inquired of the merchant what he deemed a fair value. The store owner mentioned that it encompassed a dwelling of 200 to 300 square meters, and by applying a rate of 10,000 per square meter, that ought to be accurate. Bai Wu acknowledged his comprehension and shut his eyes to focus, inquiring about his newfound capability regarding the likelihood of the opposing party accepting his proposal of 2 million yuan as remuneration. The ability indicated it was 100%, prompting him to then inquire about the probability of the other party agreeing to 3 million. And that was likewise entirely accurate. He elevated it to 4 million, and it was likewise complete. He opted to elevate it to 5 million. However, the percentage plummeted to 10%, since, for 4.5 million, after a brief moment, he lifted his eyelids, and the merchant became thrilled, inquiring if he had succeeded in perceiving it. The main character asserted that he could propose 4,300,000, as he was confident they would consent without reluctance. Should he opt to present 4.5 million, there was an 80% probability, whereas with 4,800,000, the likelihood diminished to just 50%. The merchant was astonished, remarking that predictions were indeed remarkably precise and could genuinely be correct. Bai Wu suggested that if he had any doubts, he merely needed to contact the other individual immediately and propose a trial. The main character considered this an ideal chance to evaluate the efficacy of that golden touch. The merchant resolved to make an attempt and stated that he would contact immediately to ascertain. A minute later, the shop owner was astonished, as the opposing party had consented without a moment's hesitation. He expressed his gratitude to his superior, declaring that he was indeed a celestial seer. The merchant was so overjoyed that he began to dance alone, proclaiming that fate and justice truly had to be real. Furthermore, he remarked that the master had bestowed upon him a reward that was exceedingly generous and presented 300,000 as recompense for uncovering such a remarkable sum. Bai Wu resolved to agree, yet endeavored to stay composed. Nevertheless, internally, he believed that 300,000 was entirely unforeseen fortune. The merchant promptly dispatched the 300,000 to him, and the main character remarked that he felt somewhat awkward. Yet within, he was howling, for he had acquired 300,000 with such ease, and that was truly astonishing. With the rate of achievement, existence felt like an utter deception. The store owner expressed his gratitude once more for all that he had done on his behalf, stating that he was worthy of every dollar he had just received. Bai Wu bid farewell, expressing that he had to depart at that moment, and the shopkeeper expressed gratitude once more, advising him to exercise caution on his journey back. Bai Wu believed that this was remarkably potent. As long as he utilized this golden opportunity judiciously, he could undoubtedly alter his fate and attain the zenith of his existence. The moment he exited the shop, he noticed that the canine which had collided with the window remained sprawled on the pavement. He came to the conclusion that the canine was a pedigree and inquired about the possibility of its being misplaced. The golden finger proclaimed that the likelihood was absolute. Bai Wu observed the canine frolicking with the small ball and moved closer, stating that due to that dog, he had successfully amassed a considerable fortune. Thus he would assist in reuniting it with its owner. The canine launched. The sphere ascended with tremendous strength. It impacted numerous locations, returned, and struck the canine directly on the head, then soared toward the main character's head. Bai Wu surmised that the possessor of that canine likely endured a significant struggle each day. The dog attempted to pull the protagonist to the side, and he believed that this foolish creature still needed to locate its master, yet he was utterly clueless about where to begin searching. Abruptly, the dog started sprinting at a rapid pace, disturbing several pedestrians on the sidewalk. Bai Wu resolved to trail the canine as he was uncertain whether it would genuinely locate its master, yet he felt compelled to pursue it to prevent an unfortunate event from occurring. Moments later, in a park, a young girl was capturing an image, but the dog was dashing rapidly in her direction. Bai Wu became enamored with the girl's allure. He inquired of the golden digit what the likelihood was that the girl was the canine's proprietor, and the likelihood was absolute. He believed that his fortune was elevated further since the canine's owner was, in fact, an enchanting lady. He had merely aimed to assist the canine in locating its owner for the dog's benefit, and inadvertently succeeded in evaluating the enhancement of the success ratio, yet he never anticipated such a joyful meeting. The young woman persisted in capturing images, which astonished him due to her canine had vanished, but she remained composed, capturing images with utter nonchalance. Abruptly, she glanced back and spotted the canine. She was taken aback and inquired whether the main character also owned a husky, as it bore a striking resemblance to Oreo. Bai-Wu considered that absurd, as it was her canine companion, yet she couldn't even identify her own pet. Consequently, he began to question the 100% certainty that had manifested, wondering if it might be erroneous. The girl persisted in frolicking with the dog, asserting that even its bark was identical to her dog's, though Oreo remained slightly more adorable. She went on to claim that this canine appeared quite foolish, whereas hers was more intelligent. Moreover, her dog consumed premium, all-natural dog food priced at $500 per bag, and its coat was softer and superior to that of this dog. The main character endeavored to capture her interest, believing that this attractive young woman was somewhat dim-witted. The young woman gazed at him and inquired what the matter was. Bai-Wu clarified that if everything was in order, then that was Oreo. The young woman chuckled, remarking that the humor was far from amusing, as her canine had been securely fastened to the seat. Yet as the moment she gazed at the bench, she recognized that the tether had broken. 5 minutes afterward, the young woman felt quite mortified, expressed his apologies for all her previous remarks, and conveyed his gratitude for his assistance. He included her as a new acquaintance. He informed her that it was acceptable since it was fortunate that the dog had not become lost by itself in the center of the city. However, the reality was that he had discovered an innocent young woman who had never engaged in a romantic involvement and had existed in solitude since the beginning of her life. He glanced at several of her updates, but felt somewhat disoriented since this was the inaugural occasion he had connected with an attractive woman as a friend. However, he was relieved to know he had chosen the right direction. He examined additional posts and observed that her canine was quite damaging. He indicated that the dog was somewhat unruly and occasionally damaged items, and had it been him, the property owner would have expelled him long ago. He observed that she seemed to feel a bit uncomfortable by that, and underscored that he lacked the authority to utter such remarks to her since his property owner had altered the lock on his leased flat today, leaving him without shelter. The young woman who was departing inquired why he required a rental property, emphasizing that residing in his own home was preferable. She then bid farewell, stating that she needed to return at that moment. Bai-Wu started contemplating it because now that he had achieved a favorable success rate, he no longer had to fret about his rent, as amassing wealth and purchasing a home was attainable for him. He persisted along the avenue, pondering how he could amass wealth and acquire a residence, for despite the demolition indemnity, $300,000 was insufficient for the initial payment, and such opportunities were rare. Consequently, he needed to discover a reliable and swift method to generate income. The quickest avenues for earning money could be through the lottery or stock market trading. While he strolled, he encountered a vintage artifact boutique, and came to understand that he could discover concealed treasures in vintage shops. Numerous individuals presented him with a range of items. Two individuals seated close by observed that the boy strolling in that direction was unmistakably a novice, as he appeared to possess no awareness and was remarkably uninformed. The main character squatted beside a booth and pondered that those individuals undoubtedly perceived him as a simple mark, an unsuspecting novice, and that was precisely why they were all attempting to trick him. The merchant beside him clarified that all the merchandise available there were treasured heirlooms passed down from his lineage since his last name was Li. He had learned that his forebears were lineage descendants of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty, Li Shimin. The main character reassured him not to be concerned, as he would merely examine the belongings closely. He erupted in laughter since no one anticipated that he, merely a novice, possessed the Midas touch and was impervious to deception from anyone. He then informed his skill that he wished to ascertain the success ratio of purchasing authentic antiques from that booth. The likelihood seemed to be 100%, yet the main character grew somewhat wary, inquiring whether everything was truly authentic, as it seemed improbable and something must have been amiss. He understood that, in reality, his inquiry had been phrased incorrectly due to an issue with the interpretation of antique. Who could determine the period from which those antiques originated? Perhaps they held no value. Consequently, he needed to establish a boundary for the success ratio. He inquired about the success proportion of purchasing an artifact valued over $10,000 at that stand. The likelihood emerged as 0%. He chose to inquire about an item valued at $5,000, and the likelihood also stayed at 0%. However, as he continued to gaze, he observed that an artifact from the Republic of China era was at 100%. He inquired with the vendor about the price of that item. The vendor remarked that he was a youthful individual with exceptional discernment, and that this was the most precious artifact since it had been utilized by Empress Dowager Cixi. Now, recognizing that that their encounter was fated, he proposed it for 20,000. The main character readied himself to depart, inquiring whether that object was refused, as he questioned its value of 200, while the individual appeared to be attempting to deceive him by proposing a price of 20,000. The vendor persistently pursued the sale, urging the protagonist not to turn away, promising a 50% reduction to offer it at 10,000. However, Bai Wu merely disregarded him and quickened his pace, reflecting on the prevalence of deceit, and it appeared that the threshold for antiques could not be excessively low. Therefore, he was required to establish a minimum of 10,000 as the cutoff. He approached a different vendor's booth and inquired of the expert about the probability of success when purchasing a vintage item valued at 10,000 from that stall. The likelihood emerged at 10%. He chose to modify the inquiry, inquiring about 20,000, and the percentage stayed at 10%. He chose to increase it to 30,000, and the percentage remained at 10%. He was astonished because even at 50,000, it remained at 10%, and perhaps he could discover an authentic gem. The vendor grinned and considered that maybe he ought to provide that newcomer with his initial instruction. He commenced by clarifying that acquiring antiques necessitated a discerning eye and that he conducted his affairs with honesty, never behaving like certain dishonest traders who demanded outrageous sums. He attempted to thrust a vase upon the main character, asserting that it was a valuable piece, yet the likelihood of that item possessing worth was non-existent. Thus, Bai Wu halted him, stating that there was no necessity to suggest anything as he had already made his selection. Subsequently, he indicated an artifact that had a certainty of 100% of being valued at 50,000. Bai Wu believed he was no novice, envisioning the discovery of a concealed fortune, for with the success rate he possessed, he was the Midas of the antique market and destined to become the foremost expert in antique valuation. Consequently, the vendor was observing the dawn of a genuine legend. The vendor grew somewhat perplexed, pondering the situation, as that novice seemed distinctly oblivious. Just because an object appeared vintage did not necessarily imply it was genuinely antiquated. That article was counterfeit and had merely emerged from the furnace. He contemplated how he could elevate the cost of that worthless item. Bai Wu became aware that the vendor was behaving oddly and was undoubtedly attempting to exploit him and escalate the cost. However, this occurred because he exhibited enthusiasm too rapidly, which he ought to have refrained from doing. He became overly enthusiastic due to the high success rate and allowed himself to get swept up in the moment. The vendor mentioned that he indeed possessed a substantial craving, yet he ought to heed the counsel of a knowledgeable merchant. He suggested that the expert examine the porcelain vase initially, as acquiring antiques was primarily about discernment and secondarily about affinity. He perceived a strong bond between the two, which was the reason he was offering him sincere counsel. He urged him to examine the luster of that vase, the sleek contours, the entirely artisanal creation, and the distinctly crisp tone that showcased its excellence. He underscored that it was not costly, merely 50,000, and if he successfully resold it, he would likely reap a substantial profit. Bai Wu donned a contented visage to mislead the merchant. He pondered the potential value of the object and questioned why the seller was regarding it in such a manner, as he was not advocating for the wine vessel, but rather endorsing the damaged vase instead. And he likely remained unaware that there was indeed a possible fortune valued at 50,000 located there. The main character opted to decline, asserting that he too felt acquiring antiques was about establishing a bond, and although the porcelain vase was exquisite, it bore no significance for him. He grasped the wine container and remarked that he found this vessel to be quite appealing. The vendor inquired whether he was genuinely intrigued by that bronze wine container, and judging by appearances, he possessed a discerning eye, as that was a finding he had uncovered in the rural area for 8,000. If he genuinely desired it, he could market it at the original price, and inquired whether he would agree to the proposal of 8,000, not a penny more or less. The main character was enticed to agree since, in contrast to 50,000, 8,000 was merely trifling, and that vendor appeared utterly oblivious to the genuine worth of that bronze wine receptacle. He inquired of the golden digit what the likelihood was that the vendor comprehended its actual value, and the likelihood presented itself as 0%. Bai Wu believed he had anticipated that. Armed with the success rate at his disposal, all concealed motives were within his grasp. As a result, he was able to contemplate ways to influence the negotiation while feigning the role of an inexperienced newcomer. Ultimately, regardless of how intricate the proposals were, as long as he was aware of the ultimate outcome, he would be unbeatable. Consequently, he intended to employ the likelihood of success to gauge the lowest price the vendor would agree to. He inquired about the chances of the seller consenting to part with that vessel for 4,000, and the likelihood was absolute. That astounded him. 2,000 was likewise 100%. He opted to reduce it to 1,000, and the likelihood diminished to 80%. He believed that it was was of little significance, as he could not afford to be overly avaricious. Thus he was already aware of the course of action to take. He informed the vendor that 8,000 was somewhat pricey and inquired if they could reduce the price slightly. The vendor believed that he had acquired numerous items at a remarkably low cost, and regardless of how inexpensively he sold them, the earnings would remain substantial. He informed the main character that 8,000 for such a fine object truly was not costly. Nevertheless, establishing a rapport with an individual who also comprehended the nuances was far more significant, allowing the protagonist to determine the value. Bai Wu proposed 2,000. The vendor was astonished, believing that this lad was truly negotiating fiercely, yet 2,000 remained a substantial gain. As the vendor had remained taciturn, Bai Wu resolved to press further and inquired whether he truly would not acquiesce to the 2,000. For if that were the case, they might as well abandon this dialogue altogether. The vendor ultimately conceded and declared that 2,000 was an excellent deal. In reality, he had purchased 2 pieces for 8,000 and sold the other one to an attractive woman the day before. He swiftly assembled the container and presented it to the main character, who initiated the payment transfer. Bai Wu departed, chuckling, believing that he had acquired a genuine wealth. The vendor beamed broadly, as he too had succeeded in amassing a wealth, having acquired that item at an exceptionally low cost. An item valued at merely a few yuan was sold for 2,000. It was remarkably effortless profit peddling junk, a novice attempting to emulate experts in discovering valuables. That lad was exceedingly reckless, for 2,000 was still a significant gain for him. He rejoiced with the vendor beside him, stating that the previous day a woman had acquired a wine container for 9,000, and now that silly boy had purchased the other container for 2,000. The purchaser was not as astute as the seller, and that money had been remarkably effortless to obtain. The other vendor inquired why he was exhibiting such ostentation, and inquired of old Wang whether that was not the young lady who procured the bronze wine vessel for 9,000 the previous day, the one he had just deceived. Perhaps she was present to create a disturbance. Wang responded that this truly posed no issue for him, as the exchange of money and merchandise was no longer a concern. As soon as the young woman drew near, Wang promptly started declaring that his establishment was a modest venture, thus all transactions were conclusive and there would be no reimbursements. The young woman felt somewhat disoriented and inquired if he was losing his sanity, then questioned where it was located. Wang, feeling somewhat bewildered himself, inquired about her meaning. She inquired about the location of the additional bronze wine container, expressing her willingness to offer 10,000, or if he favored, 50,000 for the wine vessel. Wang started quaking and inquired about the extent of her words, doubting if that wine container was truly so precious and how that novice could possess such knowledge. The young woman deemed his conduct somewhat peculiar and speculated that perhaps the vendor was attempting to escalate the cost. However, as she genuinely desired that item, she inquired if he sincerely believed it was insufficient, as she could increase the sum slightly if he wished, suggesting 60,000. Yet the seller did not respond. Thus, she elevated it to 80,000. The 2 vendors were taken aback by this. The young woman grew frustrated by receiving no reply whatsoever, and inquired of the supervisor whether he was not comprehending her words. Wang commenced pounding his own chest, proclaiming that the hunter had merely been ensnared by the quarry, and this was sheer folly, as he had just incurred a loss of 80,000. Another vendor erupted in laughter, remarking that in the realm of commerce, he had never submitted to anyone. However, today he had genuinely gained insight, for acquiring a heap of refuse and selling it for 80,000 was indeed remarkable. Wang inquired whether she would be willing to disburse 100,000 for that craft, and she acquiesced without reluctance, creating the vendor tumble rearward. The vendor next to him informed the young lady that he wished to share something, as old Wang had recently sold the wine container, and inquired if she could estimate its selling price, mentioning that it was for 2,000, because an antique item was sold for 2,000. The young woman inquired whether it had genuinely been sold already. Wang rose and requested her to hold on for a brief moment, assuring her that he would return immediately. However, abruptly, he perceived boisterous cries in the distance, something that was available for purchase at 300,000. The individuals were remarking that the lad's fortune was exceedingly favorable, as old Li was proposing 300,000 for that bronze wine container. The vendor adjacent to Wang mentioned that individuals were discussing the bronze wine container, and perhaps it was the identical one they had been conversing about. The lady grew annoyed, exclaiming that this was a significant inconvenience, inquiring which miscreant had pilfered her opportunity with such unfortunate circumstances. However, Bai Wu declined the sum of 300,000. Individuals grew uneasy, believing he was exhibiting excessive avarice. Elder Li proposed 400,000, asserting that he would not exceed that amount. However, Bai Wu declined once more and commenced stowing the bronze container. Li requested him him not to rush and inquired about the price the protagonist desired for it, as he would pay close attention. The main character remarked that evidently this gentleman was a specialist. Thus he, in his youth, modestly requested that they forge a friendship, and proposed a set amount of 500,000. He stated he would relinquish the remainder, as he genuinely valued their camaraderie. Li was astounded and expressed that this was utterly remarkable, extending sincere gratitude for the opportunity to encounter him. Wang was astonished that his craft was being auctioned for 500,000. Others informed Wang that they had heard the lad had only spent 2,000 for that vase, and that irrespective of who had sold it to him, that individual was likely utterly heartbroken at this moment. They inquired why he appeared so despondent. Wang inquired how that could be feasible, given that he had been involved in that industry for numerous years. Thus, how could he have marketed something so precious for such a little amount? The young woman mentioned earlier stated that 500,000 was unsatisfactory and proposed 550,000 instead. The main character gazed at her and considered that she possessed pale skin, a stunning visage, elongated legs, and that the allure and disposition of that beauty were utterly remarkable. Her haughty demeanor indicated that she was undoubtedly a young woman from an affluent background, a celestial being in her own right. In former times, he might not have even had the audacity to glance in her direction more than once. Undoubtedly, given his present success rate, discovering love was as effortless as sipping a glass of water. Conversely, the girl felt slightly irritated, pondering why that boy was gazing at her, considering he was merely a failure. Ultimately, if her grandfather had not been so obstinate and maintained that the wine container was hers, she would have avoided all that hassle. However, she was determined to obtain it regardless of the expense. Bai Wu gazed at the wine container and mused that this young lady surely desired the wine vessel entirely, indicating that he could market it for an even greater sum than anticipated. He gazed a bit further back and witnessed the vendor who had marketed it to him, asserting that evidently the wine container he had sold for 2,000 was valued at over 550,000. Once the crowd caught wind of this, they commenced ridiculing Wang, causing him to be overwhelmed with humiliation. The young woman persisted in urging the main character once more, proposing 550,000, and inquired if he intended to sell it or not. Li informed her that she was being somewhat irrational, as there existed an age-old proverb in those neighborhoods. The individual who arrived first was obligated to purchase first. The young lady chuckled, stating to the elderly man that the two had not established a pact yet and the arrangement remained available. Li perceived that the girl was rather bothersome, and her conduct appeared somewhat reminiscent to him. The pair gazed at the main character, yet he chuckled, stating that he was not the individual interested in purchasing it, allowing the two of them to converse briefly and arrive at a consensus. The young woman perceived the main character as merely another individual attempting to exploit the regulations of the vintage market to boost the cost, and seemingly, he genuinely believed that others were naive enough not to recognize the minor ruse he was attempting to execute. They proposed 560,000. However, the young lady proposed 570,000. The elderly gentleman elevated the proposal once more. The young lady proposed 600,000. Li gazed at her and remarked that she appeared somewhat recognizable, inquiring about her connection to the ancient specter Demon. The young lady mentioned that Demon was her grandfather and inquired if the elderly gentleman recognized him. Li erupted in laughter, asserting that it was a situation of erroneous identification. He underscored that he was an acquaintance of her grandfather and that he had wished for her to acquire that wine container. He formally presented himself, stating his name was Li Weiguo, a professor from the history faculty of Hangcheng University, similar to her grandfather. She remarked that he must be Grandpa Li, her grandfather's companion from childhood. She noted that he was in good health and took a morning jog each day. The main character grew somewhat exasperated and interjected to inquire whether they still intended to purchase it. The youthful lady consented, requesting Weiguo to return and look after things, inviting him to pay her grandfather a visit for tea whenever he was available, as she would personally come to collect him if necessary. A brief moment later, she remitted the payment to the main character. He believed that even though the computation had resulted in a minor discrepancy, that profit margin exceeded 300-fold. And at that moment, he had transformed into a millionaire in an instant and genuinely embodied the golden charm of Antique Street. Why would he pen humiliating tales when he was the genuine leading man of a resurgence narrative in this manhua? He gazed upon her and was captivated once more, inquiring if she would be interested in swapping WeChat information. She was somewhat taken aback by that. The main character grinned, remarking that it seemed she had a strong fascination with collectibles, and perhaps if he stumbled upon another remarkable piece in the vicinity, he could reach out to her. Qing Ting considered that flirtation to be profoundly corny, as the main character was repulsive yet amusing. He was a genuine frog aspiring to consume swan flesh. He attempted to employ his allure and referred to her as Diyatu, but she recoiled, inquiring why he had referred to her in that manner. Diyatu signified young girl or something similar. She started pondering why he was making such an effort to be amicable, a stroke of fortune in uncovering a gem, and he immediately believed he was the destined one. No one would venture to approach her. She grew somewhat annoyed, asserting that he ought not to address her by name as though he were her elder. The main character inquired of the golden finger what the likelihood was that she was his senior, and the likelihood was non-existent. He started gazing at her, contemplating that she was undeniably deserving of being a spoiled, haughty, and dignified young woman. However, he possessed the definitive advantage of the success ratio, and he would undoubtedly demonstrate his skills. He inquired about the likelihood of her being 20 years old, and the probability was absolute. He believed that both he and she were 20 years of age, yet his birthday fell on September 30th, indicating hers might be different. He inquired whether her birth month was May, but that yielded a 0% probability. He grew perplexed, pondering the situation, as she was his junior. However, she had not entered the world in the past 3 months, so it might merely be a happenstance that they shared the same birth date, and that resulted in a complete 100%. Qing Ting inquired about the game he was engaged in. Bai Wu requested her to be patient. He persisted in performing the calculations, believing that he had entered the world at 3:23 p.m., and since she was his junior, she must have been born sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight, yet the likelihood yielded 0%. He continued to inquire until he ultimately discovered the truth, and it was a remarkable coincidence. Merely a single minute separated their births. As she endeavored to embody the role of an older sibling and assert her influence over him, he would now shatter her resolve. Qing Ting grew somewhat annoyed, remarking that he was entirely unfathomable, and started to turn away. However, Bai Wu referred to her as Dia-tu once more, urging her not to believe he was being frivolous. He believed he was merely providing her a foretaste to startle her. He shut his eyes, feigning focus, stating that she would be celebrating her 20th birthday that year and was born at the close of September, inquiring if that was correct. She was astonished, inquiring how he had discovered that. The main character stated that it was quite simple, as he had computed it. However, that only heightened her annoyance, as she found the hubris displayed on that boy's visage intolerable, given that he was attempting to engage her in metaphysical discussions. She persisted in disregarding him, asserting that he was merely attempting to perform an enigmatic charade, and proceeded to stroll away. However, the main character believed he possessed something even more exact and astonishing. He remarked that it was quite simple. He merely had to reassess and highlight that she entered the world on September 30th at approximately 3:30 p.m. This caused her to halt, inquiring how he was capable of such an act. All were astonished, inquiring whether it was genuinely accurate, as the boy articulated it with remarkable accuracy, leading them to ponder if it was indeed feasible for him to possess the skill of fortune-telling. Some remarked that, based on the girl's response, he likely struck a chord. Conversely, a few individuals grew vexed, asserting that he was attempting to peddle clairvoyance in the modern age, suggesting that the young man had likely gathered her details beforehand to impress her. Such actions were deemed utterly distasteful. Bai Wu chose to stay quiet, believing that a deviant would be incapable of uncovering such intricacies, as he was now poised to reveal his genuine skill. He informed her that he would reevaluate, highlighting that she had not arrived into the world at 3:30, but rather at 3:24. He believed that the moment had arrived to administer the decisive strike, declaring that she had entered the world on September 30th in the afternoon at 3 hours, 24 minutes, and 36 seconds. She was so astonished by this that she retrieved her phone with quaking hands and contacted her mother, who responded anxiously, inquiring about what the issue was. She inquired of her mother precisely what hour she had entered the world. Her mother replied that she had arrived at approximately 3:30 p.m. on September 30th, but appeared slightly perplexed, questioning whether she truly did not recall her own birth date. However, Qing Ting responded that was not the case and requested her to be slightly more precise, inquiring if she had entered the world at 3:24. Her mother indicated that she too did not recall and would promptly verify the birth certificate stored in the safe. 3 minutes later, her mother reappeared and stated that she had been delivered at 3 hours, 24 minutes, and 36 seconds. Her mother was so astonished that she inquired how she was aware of this, but Qing Ting was even more taken aback upon uncovering the truth. She gazed intently at the main character. Bai Wu addressed her as Dia-tu once more and mentioned that if she had any inquiries, she merely needed to inquire, as her unwavering gaze was making him somewhat bashful. However, Qing Ting merely turned away in frustration, declaring that she ought not to have become inquisitive and squandered her time on that young man. The protagonist positioned himself before her and expressed regret, stating that he was merely teasing, as he had only conducted a divination earlier. She grinned fiercely and touched the hero's torso with her fingertips, fingertip, remarking that he had been accurate, even nailing the seconds. So how could he refer to that merely as foresight? She inquired if he genuinely believed she was foolish. Bai Wu grew increasingly captivated, believing that she was genuinely a deity-level beauty. Even in moments of fury, her allure remained striking. Bai Wu expressed remorse and assured that he would speak the truth moving forward, underlining that he had indeed performed the calculations. Qing Ting inquired whether he was a seer or a fraud. The main character asserted that not every clairvoyant was a fraud and inquired whether she had overlooked the techniques he had employed. He inched nearer to her and murmured that if he wasn't wrong, she was adorned in black that day. This left her even more astounded, urging him to cease his remarks. She gazed at him with irritation, and the main character pondered if it was conceivable that she had never experienced a romantic relationship prior. The likelihood of that emerging was regarded as 100%. Qing Ting inquired about his gaze and advised him not to approach so near. Bai Wu believed that due to his years of isolation, that young woman had no interest in men and was not in a romantic relationship. Therefore, who could have anticipated the possibility that she might be a lesbian? The likelihood of that occurring was perceived as 100%, yet the main character asserted that it was impossible, as lesbians were endlessly remarkable. Qing Ting felt mortified and started to shake, inquiring about what he had stated. All those nearby were astonished, gazing at her, and the main character chuckled, remarking that he had expressed precisely what she comprehended. She dashed over and dragged him into a secluded spot. Upon entering an alley, she thrust him against the wall and positioned her foot next to him, inquiring how he had discovered her involvement with another woman. Bai Wu merely mentioned that he had computed that as well, and she remarked that it was absurd. The main character inquired whether she genuinely doubted him, and edged even nearer, asserting that he could even determine that she had 3 moles. Thus, assessing someone's sexual orientation was quite effortless for him. Qing Ting was unable to utter any objections to that. She chose to include him as a companion, and the main character stated that all was well at present, and that should he discover anything favorable, he would reach out to her once more. However, prior to departing, he underscored that she could likewise request predictions or guidance. As he strolled away, he contemplated that the success ratio was truly remarkable, as it enabled him to even discern individual secrets. However, he truly had not anticipated encountering a lesbian and inadvertently revealing her with the level of success. While strolling, he noticed Wei Guo engaged in a phone conversation and pondered whom he might be contacting. Was it possible that he had overheard everything? He inquired about the likelihood of Qing Ting being uncovered by her family for her homosexuality. The likelihood initially registered at 0%, yet the success ratio started to shift, ascending to 20%. He was bewildered and inquired once more if she had been uncovered or not, until he unexpectedly conceived a brilliant notion. Perhaps this transformation was a result of his engagement with that girl. He persisted in observing Wei Guo and contemplated that this couldn't be accurate, inquiring about the likelihood of success and whether it was feasible that the elderly man was reaching out to her relatives to disclose everything. The likelihood reached 100%, and the main character believed that he had not done it intentionally. She remained positioned in the passageway and obtained the main character's communication, stating that her hidden truth had likely already been uncovered by her relatives. She was terrified by this and dashed to the side, attempting to locate the protagonist, yet she was unable to spot him. She dispatched a communication inquiring about his intention behind that. He inquired about the likelihood that her parents would reach out to her within 30 minutes, and the likelihood manifested as affirmative. He opted to reduce it to 5 minutes, and the likelihood also reached 100%. He dispatched her a message, stating that he had just performed another divination and extended his congratulations, indicating that in 5 minutes, her family would be reaching out to her for a discussion. 5 minutes later, her phone genuinely chimed. Upon her response, her mother instructed her to return without delay, as she and her father wished to pose some inquiries to her. Bai Wu inhaled deeply and remarked that, judging by the situation, she would need to articulate her thoughts clearly. In reality, parents consistently embodied unconditional affection, perpetually offering unrestrained love, similar to having departed from home solo, with the likelihood of achievement resting in his grasp. That was merely a slogan for others, yet his domain had already transformed. It was a shame to encounter an enchanting woman yet be incapable of engaging with her. Abruptly, his device started to chime as well. Immediately after he responded, he inquired of his mother why she had contacted him so unexpectedly and whether anything had occurred. However, the main character was astonished to realize her desire, as she aimed to set up a blind date. He grew annoyed, asserting that he was merely 20 years old and she was already pressuring him into a blind date, which he declined. However, as was customary, his mother ultimately persuaded him. By 8:15 in the evening, he had already arrived at the eatery. believing that, as a genuine gentleman, he ought to be courteous and show up slightly ahead of time. He gazed at the young woman's picture and pondered that, with her sophisticated and enchanting demeanor, she likely had numerous admirers, so what could compel her to seek a blind date? The moment the woman stepped inside, the main character glanced over and observed Qing Ting appearing somewhat uneasy as she trailed behind a woman. He was taken aback, inquiring what she was doing there as well, and who was phoning him, speculating if it might be what he was contemplating. The success ratio indicated that the blind date was with Qing Ting's companion, and the percentage of that was 100%. He inquired whether this chance encounter might also trigger a series of events resulting from his unintentional revelation of her, and the likelihood was absolute. He observed the situation and remarked that one desired to part ways, while the other wished to mend things. The narrative was becoming excessively dramatic. Qing Ting's partner, or former partner, gazed at the main character and requested Qing Ting to release her arm, causing her wail. Bai Wu was taken aback, as that girl's stare could obliterate him. The girl approached Bai Wu and presented herself, stating that her name was Mu Ye. She expressed that she perceived the protagonist as exceptionally admirable and attractive, and expressed her desire to be with him. All those in their vicinity were astonished by such a pronouncement, even him. On the contrary, Qing Ting was devastated, weeping for her friend. Bai Wu gazed at Qing Ting and remarked that this was quite perplexing. Ye inquired whether he held any disfavor towards her. The main character attempted to elucidate, asserting that it was not solely due to her genuine beauty and exceptional qualities, but rather that he suspected a seductive ploy had manifested in that situation. Ye edged nearer to him and declared that she was entirely earnest, emphasizing that this was no laughing matter, and embraced him. He inquired about the success proportion, questioning whether it was certain that this was not a deception, and the likelihood emerged as 0%. He remarked that he had consistently believed this to be an unfortunate occurrence that had descended unexpectedly. She shoved him, investigated his gaze, and unexpectedly pressed their lips against the main character, rendering unfortunate Qing Ting feel utterly worthless. Yet collapsed onto Bai Wu and urged him to depart. He inquired about their destination, and she mentioned that he was heading to her residence to meet her family. Qing Ting fled. Bai Wu perceived that Ye was evidently reluctant, and while this was not a snare for him, she was likely employing him as a barrier to compel Qing Ting to relent. The success rate indicated that this was entirely accurate. Bai Wu believed that while he had indeed gained some advantages, being controlled by her without cause was somewhat disconcerting. The pair gazed at one another, and the ambience remained decidedly uncomfortable. Furthermore, the main character pondered that without the success rate, how could he ascertain her sexual orientation? Remaining silent also misled others. Ye rose and inquired if he would be joining them. Bai Wu appeared somewhat perplexed and questioned whether she genuinely intended to introduce him to her family. The success ratio was flawless. He remained doubtful, pondering if this was genuine, if she truly wasn't merely employing him as a safeguard, if she genuinely desired a romantic outing or a partner, or whether she was merely having him encounter her parents as her partner to alleviate the circumstances slightly. Each inquiry yielded a success probability of 100%. Indeed, contacted him with weeping eyes, turned away, and inquired about his desires, as he had already exploited the circumstance and was now genuinely prepared to surrender. The main character grew somewhat vexed, considering this to be quite bothersome. She possessed sufficient beauty to achieve anything she desired, so shouldn't he be the one reaping the benefits in this situation? He observed that she was weeping and grew somewhat nostalgic, stating that he felt no remorse for the events that transpired. Nevertheless, he was slightly perturbed as he hadn't even consented to date her, and he pondered why all the women he wished to engage with casually identified as lesbians. Yet he remained oblivious to her thoughts. Some time afterward, at her residence, upon her arrival, she contacted her father and mother, informing them of her return. Her mother seemed annoyed, questioning why she had returned early when she was expected to be on a blind date. However, Ye presented Bai Wu, stating that he was her partner. The main character acknowledged her presence. Nevertheless, he felt somewhat uneasy, believing that his tender nature had overwhelmed him and that he had been led to that residence without even making a choice, leaving him uncertain about his next steps. He pondered whether tackling yet another contentious issue also constituted aiding a vulnerable maiden in trouble. Her mother swiftly altered her demeanor and started grinning, inquiring whether she truly had a boyfriend and why she hadn't mentioned it earlier. Unexpectedly, another individual in the space exclaimed, inquiring if that had genuinely occurred. The main character was utterly taken aback, believing that amidst all the tumult, it seemed someone was approaching wielding a knife. Once her father showed up, he seized Bai Wu by the arm, remarking that the young man appeared rather spirited. Ye mentioned that they had previously been involved during their high school years, but they separated due to to their academic commitments, and she had not anticipated encountering him again at a blind date. Her father gazed intently at the protagonist, while her mother expressed delight, remarking that she now comprehended why her grades had slightly declined during her last year. Her father pulled the main character aside, questioning why they were discussing that, and instructed him to enter promptly. He requested his wife to whip up some of her finest culinary creations for the evening. As he was pulled along, the main character recognized that their fervor was such that had he not been aware in advance, he might have believed this could be a seductive ploy. Her father escorted both of them to a chamber and informed the protagonist that they could remain there momentarily while he and his spouse would prepare some meals for them to enjoy. Once he exited the chamber, Bai Wu inquired whether she was genuinely the biological offspring of that man, and the likelihood was absolute. The pair erupted in laughter just as her mother walked into the room. Her father swiftly returned, inquiring of his wife about her activities, and nudged her aside, remarking that the two of them could proceed uninterrupted with whatever they had been engaged in, then shut the door once more. In the corridor, they could hear her father conversing boisterously and eagerly with his spouse, declaring that they ought to concoct a soup that would invigorate that young man. She felt a slight flush of embarrassment at this, noting that it was the first occasion her parents had encountered her boyfriend and perhaps they were a tad too enthusiastic. The main character was somewhat perplexed due to, evidently, that young woman's guardians had become exceedingly eager and engaged during the initial visit. Beyond the door, both her father and mother were attempting to eavesdrop on the events occurring within. However, her father was somewhat perturbed, inquiring why there was no action, as he had explicitly instructed that young man that a significant opportunity lay directly ahead of him. However, her mother grew slightly anxious, inquiring with the father whether he truly was unperturbed that the young man might become so avaricious that he would exploit their unfortunate daughter. However, the father hurried over to her and placed his hand over her mouth, urging her to lower her voice slightly, for if she did not take a chance, the cub would be unable to reach the bear. He grasped a butcher's knife, contemplating that they would be unable to discern its authenticity without an attempt. Moreover, they had no reason for concern as he was adequately ready. If that individual had the audacity to take any action, he would face consequences. The main character endeavored to draw nearer to her, yet she receded slightly, terrified. Bai Wu clarified that he merely wished to take a moment to converse with her. However, Yer, still apprehensive about the incident, expressed remorse and mentioned that perhaps she required additional time to acclimate to the new relationship. The main character stepped back slightly and remarked that perhaps he had been a bit overconfident, and if she genuinely felt uneasy about the circumstance, he could allow her some additional distance. She was somewhat taken aback, expressed gratitude to him, and remarked that it was acceptable, asserting that she was capable and would exert effort to adjust. Bai Wu believed that Yer was indeed an exquisite woman with no flaws in her appearance, and if only she were genuinely his partner, life would be more fulfilling. He chose to inquire with his capability regarding the likelihood of success if he grasped her hand at that moment, and the response indicated an 80% chance. He chose to inquire about an embrace, and the likelihood decreased to 76%. He believed that perhaps he had preserved the universe, but soon dismissed that notion, considering that she merely sought a phony partner to mislead her guardians. Moreover, he was a fit, virtuous, outstanding bachelor, so how could he engage in such a charade? He concluded that he should not entangle himself in that predicament, and that it would be more beneficial for the young woman to confront her situation with sincerity. He attempted to inch nearer to grasp her hand, but ultimately stumbled, and descending, her father hurriedly burst in, exclaiming and inquiring what was amiss and if she was all right. However, upon witnessing the circumstances, he was astonished, and Yer exclaimed, inquiring of her father what he was doing in that location. Her mother endeavored to mend the situation and reprimanded her spouse, assuring her daughter that it was reassuring to see her in perfect health, as her father was quite easily frightened. Bai Wu inquired why he was grasping a cleaver in his grip. This heightened his anxiety, leading him to ponder what was transpiring, since he had accomplished nothing and had been pulled into this without justification. Therefore, what was the individual doing as he approached with a cleaver in his grasp? He inhaled deeply, asserting that he had not altered his opinion, but abruptly recognized that her father evidently did not accept that he was in a relationship with his daughter. The spouse admonished her partner, inquiring if he had lost his senses, as they were merely assessing whether he was a replacement. So why had her father come in holding a butcher's knife? He clarified that he felt somewhat apprehensive, as even though that lad was merely a replacement, he could be utilized and attempt to achieve something greater. In the meantime, the main character found himself in a state of bewilderment, as he had been inexplicably thrust into the situation to masquerade as a romantic partner, only to be nearly regarded by her parents as a deviant. No one would accept this unexpected turn of events if he recounted it to anyone. Yer inquired whether he was all right. The main character gazed at her, contemplating that despite everything. Ultimately, this was a familial issue, and he would rather not assume that role any longer. It was wiser to depart while he still had the chance. He rose and gazed at her, remarking that they could delve into this further at a later time, as it was already becoming late. Year attempted to dissuade the protagonist, inquiring if he truly wished to retract his promise at this moment. However, Bai Wu maintained a solemn demeanor and inquired whether she genuinely thought that a trivial gesture could mislead her guardians, for he was already indicating that he no longer wished to participate in this act. They were engaging in this because they had concern for her, yet she merely sought to manipulate him to mislead them. He underscored that transparent dialogue with her guardians was the most effective method for resolving issues. The year was astonished by this and grasped the protagonist's arm, inquiring if he genuinely could assist her at least on this occasion. Bai Wu grinned, recognizing that he was now the one in control of the situation. Abruptly, the pair commenced conversing at a high volume, causing her parents to feel anxious. Her father inquired why it appeared that the two were disputing. Her mother felt somewhat pleased, remarking that only youthful couples quarreled, attributing the entire situation to her father's labeling him as a substitute. However, she abruptly recognized that perhaps it was due to her spouse intimidating the main character with the blade, which had led to a confrontation between them. Now they had to devise a solution, as young couples often parted ways following disputes. They attempted to dash to the chamber, but the main character swung the door open and emerged with a grave expression, remaining silent. While he strolled, he contemplated that he could no longer remain there, for this circumstance was not benefiting that girl, but instead damaging her. Her mother rushed over to the main character, advising him not to put on his footwear as she had inadvertently soaked them while making the soup. Bai Wu was taken aback by this when he noticed that his footwear was indeed damp. The young boy emerged from the room and inquired of his mother how the soup she had been concocting in the kitchen ended up spilling there. His father affirmed this, remarking that his spouse was quite negligent. He then addressed the young boy, pointing out that his shoes were damp and questioning how he planned to return home. The mother proposed that he remain there overnight until his footwear dried the following day. Bai Wu believed he had clarified everything to Year. Now, how she would confront the situation relied solely on her. Her father also gazed at the protagonist and inquired why he was unable to remain there that evening. However, Bai Wu observed them and stated that he had to visit the hospital to attend to a patient, as the son of his 7th grade aunt's niece was unwell. Thus, he had to bid farewell. Both the father and mother felt somewhat bewildered following that extensive clarification regarding the aunt, daughter, and all related matters. A little while later, the main character was reclining on his mattress, contemplating that generating income was far more dependable since as long as he continued to earn, he would remain content. Therefore, he needed to return to purchase more collectibles the following day. The following dawn, Wang was polishing his collectibles, reflecting on his negligence and how it had cost him financially to an amateur. Thus, he felt the urgency to discover a significant opportunity at this moment. He observed that an individual had paused in front of his store and gazed upward with a grin adorning his features, inquiring if there was anything the individual favored in the shop. However, as he gazed ahead, he realized that it was the main character. Bai Wu inquired whether he had ventured to the countryside to gather additional antiques. Wang grinned and informed the main character that he had come at an ideal moment, as he had acquired additional antiques during the night, and inquired if he would be interested in viewing them. He believed that with each item he purchased, he could generate an outrageous gain. Bai Wu requested Wang to display the intriguing items he possessed. He gestured towards several objects, stating that these were the acquisitions he had made in a village the previous night and that he had expended 50,000 to obtain that porcelain collection. Furthermore, he stressed that he had deliberately inquired with the locals for details and learned that the family had thrived alongside Li Shimin during the late Sui dynasty and had flourished during the reign of Empress Wu. Thus, those sparse ceramic items might be Bai Wu inquired whether it was Tang Sankai. Wang stated that was precisely accurate, regardless of whether it pertained to the artistry, finish, or other elements. Those select porcelain items were highly likely Tang Sankai, and given that the main character was a longtime patron, they could negotiate a favorable arrangement. Bai Wu inquired about the price at which he was offering those items. Wang replied with 60 and solicited his opinion on that valuation. The main character exhibited a look of astonishment and remarked that the vendor was truly remarkable for asking merely 60 for that china collection. Moreover, he believed that the ceramic collection genuinely exhibited exceptional craftsmanship, as purchasing it from a porcelain manufacturer would amount to 200. Wang attempted to clarify that it wasn't exactly as such and that the main character had likely misinterpreted something. However, Bai Wu interjected the vendor, asserting that there was no need for clarification as 60 was indeed exceedingly affordable. If he were to acquire all those ceramic items for 60, his conscience would remained troubled. Wang stated that Bai Wu was caressing his soul. The main character proposed a fresh arrangement as he did not wish for Wang to incur significant financial losses. He intended to contemplate for a moment and provide a more equitable valuation for it. He inquired of the golden finger whether those ceramic items were indeed authentic. However, the likelihood emerged as merely 14.28%. The main character believed this was anticipated since they were all counterfeit. However, abruptly, he comprehended that he had miscalculated. If it manifested as 14.28%, that indicated 1 out of 7. Perhaps among the 7 ceramic items, there existed one genuine antique. Should that item prove authentic, its worth could reach into the tens of millions. Golden Finger asserted that it was entirely authentic and the likelihood of its worth escalating to tens of millions was 90%. The main character completed his inspection and instructed the vendor to provide him with an authentic price, inquiring about the cost of that set. Wang believed that this moment he had struck gold and declared that for merely 600,000 he could acquire the complete collection. Bai Wu inquired whether that was indeed the cost. The vendor mentioned that if he genuinely believed it was excessively priced, he could offer a reduction and adjust the cost to 500,000. Bai Wu remarked that the cost was excellent and that he would proceed with the transaction immediately. He swiftly conveyed 500,000, gathered all the fragments and fled. Wang regarded all of that as quite dubious and pondered whether there truly existed an authentic item within that porcelain collection. Nevertheless, he rapidly revised his opinion, believing it to be unfeasible since that China collection had been sold in bulk from the displays of the Tongsan Kai studio in that rural locale. He grew joyful, reflecting that today's youth truly believed they were the fortunate central characters of tales. Ultimately, it was virtually implausible to discover such a unique and authentic treasure at any market stand, and judging by his appearance, that lad was still too naive to grasp that. Offloading that collection for 500,000 when he had acquired everything for merely 1,500 was remarkably effortless profit, and the novice was still merely a novice toying with him. Abruptly, a vehicle barreled directly into the center of that store. A young woman exited the vehicle and, referred to as Wang, stating that the counterfeit piece Tong San Kai had sold him for 1,500 the previous evening. She now wished to repurchase for 1 million. Upon hearing this, Wang understood that he had once more forfeited a successful ticket. The young woman persistently pleaded and clarified that one of the ceramic items in that collection held great significance for her grandfather and was not available for purchase. Thus she wished to reclaim it. Wang clarified that it wasn't a matter of him being unwilling to sell it, but rather that he had already prepared it for shipment and sold it to another individual. The vendor next to him agreed and inquired how that elderly gentleman had succeeded in tricking the young lad. In reality, the youth had invested 500,000 in that novel product from various artisan workshops and was utterly foolish. He underscored his jealousy towards Wang, inquiring when he might encounter someone as innocent. Wang responded that it was typical for youth to be restless, yet the girl started weeping, declaring that everything had come to an end. She believed that merely for the sake of pretending to enjoy eating chicken, she had positioned that delicate porcelain item on the shelf, only for it to be sold. Now she felt cursed, claiming that today marked the low point of her sensibility. Wang endeavored to soothe her, urging her not to weep. Despite the fact that the delicate item was a cherished masterpiece of her grandfather, ultimately, it was merely a reproduction. Consequently, she merely needed to express her regrets to her grandfather, and all would be well. However, the young woman grew vexed, inquiring who claimed it was merely a facsimile. Within that China collection, one item was authentic, inherited from her lineage. An individual had previously proposed 10 million for it, but her grandmother had declined to sell, as she was hesitant to relinquish it back then. Wang was unable to comprehend it. The vendor next to him started ridiculing him once more, stating that Wang had indeed been remarkable, as the previous day he had sold a bronze wine container valued at 600,000 for merely 2,000. Furthermore, today, regrettably, he had permitted an authentic item worth 10 million to be sold for just 500,000. The young woman inquired about the whereabouts of the individual who had purchased the porcelain. Wang replied that he had headed toward Guiyun Pavilion. In the interim, within the pavilion, the main character was already having the object assessed. The evaluator remarked that the depiction was vibrant and the finish was flawless, signifying that it was in outstanding condition. The individual scrutinizing it remarked that he possessed a camel in that form within his residence, precisely resembling that artifact, and that it was exceptionally uncommon for a millennium-old porcelain item to be so alike. He stressed that the main character had mentioned Wang had sold it to him under the impression that his granddaughter had clandestinely removed it for sale. The main character believed that Tang Sankai had been inherited from the Tang dynasty and was precisely the same object that the man was referring to as his own. Perhaps that object had originally belonged to the elderly gentleman. The golden digit assented prevented, providing a likelihood of 100%. Bai Wu nearly suffocated as a result of that. The elderly gentleman was taken aback and inquired what the issue was. The main character clarified that it was not severe, as he had merely scorched himself by accident. Bai Wu pondered whether it was conceivable that the merchandise had been pilfered by the vendor, yet the likelihood of that was non-existent. The main character grew anxious, for if it was not the vendor, then possibly the elderly man's granddaughter had traded it to the merchant. The likelihood of that manifesting as 100%. Bai Wu gazed at the elderly gentleman, contemplating that he had evidently nurtured a gifted granddaughter. The elderly gentleman clarified that the item would likely fetch $12 million at auction. Nevertheless, he mentioned that if the main character was agreeable, he would prefer to purchase the item for $9 million and inquired whether that was satisfactory. Bai Wu believed that $9 million was not an insignificant sum. Furthermore, that item had originally been owned by another individual. Bai Wu acquiesced to the proposal, expressing his intent to comply with the gentleman's desires. The elderly gentleman retrieved a card from his wallet and presented it to the main character, stating that it was his contact card and that if he discovered any valuable items in the future, he could reach out to him at any moment. Bai Wu expressed his gratitude and exited the pavilion while gazing at the elder's name, which was Che Yongkong. The young woman dashed out of the vehicle, and the main character was astonished to observe that she was sprinting with such speed that she could tumble at any instant. He realized that the likelihood of her descending was absolute, prevented it from occurring, urging her to decelerate and exercise a bit more caution to avoid a tumble. She stated that her name was Che Xiaoxiao and that she would never succumb, and that the opening line was so absurd that it led her to ponder whether he had been a lifelong celibate, a genuine Iron Man. The main character remarked that these were benevolent intentions misconstrued as malevolent motives, and he was merely attempting to caution her. He believed that this young woman truly did not value generosity, but unexpectedly recalled that her name was Che Xiaoxiao. He inquired of the golden finger whether she was the remarkable granddaughter of the elderly gentleman who had parted with her family's heirloom. The likelihood emerged as 100%, and he believed that it truly was a serendipity to encounter her precisely in that spot. Che Xiaoxiao persisted in her brisk pace, ultimately stumbled over a rock, and surely tumbled into the hero's embrace. She was taken aback, inquiring what sort of ruse that man had employed and how she had genuinely tumbled. The individuals in their vicinity grew uneasy, proclaiming that societal values were deteriorating and urged them to refrain from being so uninhibited in public, as that was inappropriate. Che Xiaoxiao felt flustered and requested the main character to release her promptly so she could proceed on her journey. However, Bai Wu extended his arms, indicating that she ought to be the sole individual to release her grip, as she was entirely attached to him. Upon coming to this realization, she withdrew, and Bai Wu stated that if there were no other matters to address, he would depart immediately. Yet she cried out for him to cease. The main character lifted his hands, asserting that he had not committed any wrongdoing, and implored her not to attempt to exploit him. She seized his phone, claiming that he was quite fortunate since she had to attend to some pressing issues. Therefore, he was required to provide his contact details so she could arrange to resolve matters with him at a later time. Bai Wu believed he had merely graciously assisted her in rising. He glanced at the phone and realized that she had included him as a connection. He started to stroll, pondering that he hadn't anticipated encountering a girl there and having her add him. However, now that he possessed some wealth, he felt emboldened to spend a bit more lavishly, considering whether he should purchase a vehicle or a residence first. Wang inquired about to whom the protagonist had sold that porcelain and the amount he had fetched for it. Bai Wu replied that he had sold it to Boss Che for 9 million. Wang simply remarked that it was acceptable. The protagonist mused that the portly man appeared remarkably impressive, remaining so composed after losing such a substantial sum of money. Wang merely grinned, asserting that he would still handle that rascal appropriately. Xiao Xiao gazed at her grandfather and understood that the fragment was already in his possession. She believed that it was now complete and that a swift departure would be more advantageous. However, her grandfather perceived her presence and called out, commanding her to cease her concealment and enter immediately. Yong Kong was admiring his singular item, which had been sold for 200 and repurchased for 9 million. He inquired of his granddaughter why she had the opportunity to visit her aged grandfather. Nevertheless, the update was exceptionally favorable, and he underscored that he had recently acquired something remarkable. Xiao Xiao grew increasingly terrified, believing that she had failed to arrive promptly and that her grandfather had ultimately purchased that item again. This was extraordinarily unfortunate. Yong Kong inquired about the situation as she was behaving oddly. The girl grew frightened, responding that it was nothing. However, the elderly gentleman was already familiar with that demeanor. He recalled that the previous instance she had behaved in such a manner was when she had disposed of his cherished ceramics for a mere 10 win. She grew increasingly peculiar while the elderly gentleman examined the object he had recently acquired. He then gazed at her, astonished, and started piecing together the details, stating that she had been at his residence the previous evening. Xiao Xiao bolted away, exclaiming to her grandfather that she was unwell and required immediate medical attention. However, the elderly man rose furiously, commanding her to halt. While she sprinted, she was pleading with her grandmother for salvation, as her grandfather was being excessively cruel. Yong Kong was nearly reaching her, urging her to contemplate thoroughly what she had just executed. However, before he could take any action, her grandmother yelled at him over the phone, inquiring why he was raising his voice at her beloved granddaughter, pointing out that he was nearly 80 years old and still lost his composure over a mere child. Xiao Xiao seized the moment and fled, pondering who had reacted so swiftly to prevent her from reclaiming it before her grandfather discovered. However, she paused and started contemplating that she had merely exited the pavilion, and the sole individual who had departed was that man who had foreseen her downfall, indicating his vision was exceptionally keen. Somewhere, otherwise, the main character sensed as though someone were discussing him. He pondered whether that unscrupulous vendor, who had been behaving oddly, had chosen to attempt to implicate him. The likelihood emerged, asserting that the endeavor to implicate him was absolute. Yet, Bai Wu was not particularly concerned about that. He inquired of the gilded digit if he would be ensnared, if someone would dispatch an individual to confront him, or if that vendor would persist in amassing rubbish to attempt to mislead him. His capacity indicated that the likelihood of the vendor persisting in his attempts to mislead him was absolute. Yet, the main character was delighted by this, as with his level of achievement, he was essentially unbeatable. Nonetheless, discovering valuables hinged completely on fortune, and despite his abilities, there might be no riches to be found on Antique Street. Had it not been for Xiao Xiao's negligence, he wouldn't have amassed several million. Furthermore, he considered the erroneous sale of an artifact for merely 200 to be an audacious act, and the realm of the affluent was genuinely perplexing. However, he came to a realization and pondered that this could not be accurate, because the young women he had encountered lately were all peculiar. For the sake of caution, he believed it would be wiser to refrain from associating with Xiao Xiao, not to indicate that he still needed to contemplate his options in the event that he couldn't discover any riches. However, as he pondered these matters, a daring notion struck him. He inquired of the Golden Finger whether it would be feasible to uncover a treasure at the vintage market the following day, and the likelihood was unequivocal. The main character felt elated, believing that this was precisely anticipated, as he could even foresee beforehand whether he would discover something or not. Accumulating tens of millions daily was a fantasy materializing into existence. He gazed at a vehicle stationed beside him, reflecting that he couldn't resist exhibiting his success when fortune smiled upon him. Ultimately, a genuine man ought to possess an impressive car, and that bus stop ought to transport him to the car market. Upon his arrival at the bus terminal, he observed that Xiao Xiao was present as well and deemed this somewhat questionable. Abruptly, he got an alert on his mobile device. That young woman was inquiring about what she ought to present to her grandfather as a gesture of reconciliation, as she felt too apprehensive to return home with him in such a furious state. Bai Wu considered that girl somewhat naive, yet he observed an unfamiliar man next to her, and inquired of the Golden Finger whether it was conceivable that he was a burglar. The likelihood was 50%. The individual started advancing nearer and nearer, and the main character obtained verification that the bus predator had surfaced with an assurance of 100%. He dispatched her a message indicating that the individual in the dark trench coat next to her did not appear to be trustworthy, and advised her to exercise caution. Both she and the ruffian were taken aback. She glanced sideways, pondering the reason for the protagonist's presence and incessantly uttering something contemptible. She responded to the message, stating that it was him once more, and remarked that this was quite unfortunate. The main character grew vexed, remarking that once more his virtuous actions had been misconstrued as malevolent motives, and derided the young woman, asserting that she was thankless and underscoring his indifference to the outcome. Abruptly, the bus appeared, signaling the northern pathway of the metropolis, and the travelers who were embarking initially had to proceed toward the rear. The individual behind Xiao Xiao gently placed his hand on her shoulder. She appeared somewhat annoyed, prompting him to retract his hand with a chuckle. He then expressed his regrets, explaining that he had stumbled due to the throng of people. Xiao Xiao merely disregarded the circumstances and returned to using her mobile device. The main character observed the circumstance and realized that the girl truly grasped nothing at all while the man readied himself to seize her once more. Bai Wu observed this and concluded that it was anticipated. He had to take action, as that young woman was remarkable, and he could not merely overlook a female being handled without consent. He started advancing towards the man and yelled at him, but prior to him taking any action, Xiao Xiao hit the deviant, then seized, grasped him by the arm and struck his most delicate region. Bai Wu was terrified by what he was witnessing, yet she persisted in striking that individual, tossing him forcefully onto the floor in the presence of all. The other individuals were somewhat bewildered, failing to grasp what was unfolding in that situation. Xiao Xiao exclaimed, somewhat flustered, that the man had been intentionally attempting to make physical contact with her. Bai Wu was taken aback, considering that the physique of that young woman seemed to align with her nimbleness, leading him to speculate that she might be a form of mixed martial artist. However, Xiao Xiao was genuinely intrigued by how that unfortunate individual had succeeded in foreseeing that she would be assaulted once more, as he appeared to be more accurate than she in assessing individuals and situations. This struck her as somewhat peculiar. Bai Wu, intimidated by her power, feared that this time his fate was sealed, as he realized that if she found out he had purchased the Tang Sang Kai, he would likely be dead by now. He concluded that he needed to dispose of that girl swiftly. It was merely 2 stops to the vehicle market, so it should only take a few moments. However, the gilded digit stated that the likelihood of that occurrence was non-existent. The main character was somewhat taken aback, inquiring about the situation and why the bus would not arrive at his destination in just a few minutes. This was remarkably unfortunate. Upon boarding the bus, he cast a glance at her, pondering that he was particularly unfortunate today and wondered if there might be a congestion or a vehicular collision. However, the likelihood for both was displayed as 0%. Consequently, he sensed an ominous premonition regarding the forthcoming events. He inquired whether it might be the act of some offender, as this was exceedingly strange. The golden finger asserted that the likelihood of a criminal abduction was nil. The chance of a criminal seizing a hostage was also nil, yet the probability of a criminal igniting a blaze was a definitive 100%. Furthermore, the likelihood of the offender already being aboard the bus was unequivocally 100%. The main character grew frantic, inquiring what actions he should take, as the offender had already entered the bus, and if he were to act impulsively, he would surely cause the perpetrator to be even more vigilant. If the offender triumphed, everyone aboard the bus would be doomed. However, if he attempted to thwart the arson, the likelihood of success would likely be non-existent, even without any assessment. As time was critically pressing, he resolved to contact the authorities without delay. He contacted the police communications center and stated that he wished to report an offense, as there was an offender who planned to ignite a bus. The police requested that he supply the precise location. Bai Wu provided the bus number, mentioning that it had recently reached the antique market stop, with the forthcoming stop being the automobile commerce city. He stressed that there were individuals aboard the bus, and the perpetrator was one of them. The dispatcher communicated that they comprehended the situation thoroughly and were commencing an urgent response. He urged the authorities to expedite their arrival, as the perpetrator was transporting 8 to 9 liters of fuel, and igniting the bus during the process could result in injuries. Nonetheless, the dispatcher commenced inquiring how the main character had unearthed this information, and if he possessed any evidence. Bai Wu reflected that it was entirely finished, as he had been excessively concentrated on employing the success ratio for his calculations. The dispatcher persisted in conversing with him, inquiring whether he was certain about this, and how he was aware of a felon planning to ignite the bus, as well as how he had verified that the individual possessed 8 to 9 liters of fuel, and how he was informed that the culprit aimed to initiate the blaze between those 2 stations. Bai Wu found himself in a state of despair, contemplating the reality that he possessed no evidence, and questioned if he should claim to have extraordinary abilities, recognizing that even then, no one would take him seriously. He observed the bus shutting its doors and beginning to depart. He disconnected the call, believing that it was too tardy. Nonetheless, although the authorities had been alerted, he still required to locate that offender. However, immediately following him, Xiao Xiao also boarded the bus and inquired about her presence, speculating whether she might be attempting to create difficulties for him, as this was a critical situation. Yet Xiao Xiao merely grinned. The main character believed this was unfavorable, as if that girl became infatuated with him once more, it would lead to considerable complications. Consequently, he had to locate the perpetrator swiftly. He got a phone call from the law enforcement agency. Upon receiving a response, the officer disclosed that they had reached out to an off-duty law enforcement officer present on the bus, who would observe the protagonist attentively, along with the circumstances aboard the vehicle. Nonetheless, if the protagonist verified the presence of a suspect for his own protection, he was advised to behave ordinarily. Bai Wu experienced a slight sense of ease upon learning that a law enforcement officer was present. He glanced over his shoulder and noticed Xiao Xiao gazing at him. He gazed ahead once more and speculated that the law enforcement officer was unaware of the identity of the offender. How, then, could he apprehend the perpetrator? Consequently, he had to devise a strategy to address this predicament. The culprit was likely seated. The gilded digit asserted asserted that the likelihood of the offender being positioned was absolute. Yet, the likelihood of him occupying a seat in the front section of the bus was 0%, whereas the likelihood of him being positioned in the rear was 100%. Bai Wu began making his way to the rear of the bus, yet the girl continued to trail behind him. Bai Wu inquired why she was trailing him as he searched for an offender transporting roughly 9 liters of gasoline, as this was no trivial matter. As he observed the travelers, he perceived something peculiar and surmised that it would be challenging to transport such a quantity of gasoline onto the bus. The offender had likely partitioned it into beverage containers or similar items, suggesting he ought to be carrying a satchel. The individual directly before him was behaving oddly, clutching a satchel. Bai Wu suspected it was that individual, as he was gripping the bag with great firmness. Yet, before he could approach any nearer, the man started to unseal the bag. The protagonist felt he had acted too swiftly, stirring a sense of unease within him, or perhaps he intended to intervene slightly sooner, but in any case, it was too late at that moment. Bai Wu remained there uneasily, contemplating ways to alleviate the man's mistrust, or if it might be more effective to launch a swift assault and incapacitate him promptly. Xiao Xiao seized the hero's shoulder and urged him to remain concealed. Bai Wu glanced back and reflected that he regretted this instance, yet that official was likely observing him intently. The gilded digit asserted that the likelihood of that occurrence was absolute. He faced her and referred to her as grandmother, admitting that he had been mistaken, as he genuinely did not believe she was an ungainly, flat-chested woman. He advised her to cease following him, for he was a naive youth. He had been contemplating that this predicament was quite pressing, and he required her assistance to divert the perpetrator, thus creating a chance to intervene. In doing so, he could also notify the law enforcement officer, achieving 2 objectives with a single effort. The offender was preoccupied by that dispute, and the main character believed that this was a favorable chance. Xiao Xiao ready to deliver a strike and inquired why the protagonist had ceased fleeing. He feigned that he intended to evade the strike, claiming that this was merely a misinterpretation, and seized the offender's satchel, causing it to unfasten. The offender rose furiously and inquired about his actions. Bai Wu recognized that the individual was genuinely careful, and it was conceivable that he had undergone training. However, unexpectedly, Xiao Xiao struck the man in the visage. The main character was astonished as she persisted in striking him and swiftly subdued him in the presence of all. Bai Wu inquired if she was a superhero, but Xiao Xiao produced her handcuffs and remarked that this was a matter for law enforcement and the offender was now in custody. She grasped one of the containers and inhaled its scent, declaring that it truly was fuel. Bai Wu was astonished that she had genuinely become a law enforcement officer. Once outside the bus, Xiao Xiao remarked that everything had been completed and gazed at the main character, stating that she would inform that he was the one who alerted them, and now he was required to elucidate how he had knowledge of it. The main character found this girl exceedingly vexatious, and she continued to pursue him. It was preferable to evade complications rather than generate them, so he had to devise a strategy to extricate himself from this situation. He gazed at her and remarked that she ought to maintain this as a confidential matter, for, in reality, he was a modest individual capable of foretelling the future. If she doubted his words, she merely had to reflect on the occurrences that had transpired previously. Xiao Xiao believed that, in reality, that individual was somewhat unfortunate. The main character was startled by her response. He believed he was in significant peril because he truly could not communicate indiscreetly or consume his food appropriately. At this moment, he could no longer evade this situation and had to devise a solution promptly. Xiao Xiao grew frustrated and struck the wall, exclaiming that he was still feigning ignorance, and inquired once more about how he was aware. The main character grew apprehensive and inquired about what she wished to learn. Xiao Xiao stated that a vigilant bystander happened to stroll by and uncovered an offender who planned to ignite a bus. Bai Wu lowered her hand, remarking that there was no necessity for gratitude, as it was his obligation as a considerate member of society. However, she persisted with annoyance, remarking that judging by his demeanor, he would not shed tears until he beheld the casket. She pushed him against the wall, asserting that she recalled distinctly that he had not boarded the bus when he contacted the authorities. Furthermore, he was unfamiliar with the perpetrator, yet he was aware that the individual was transporting 8 to 9 liters of fuel. The individuals in proximity started to feel intrigued, observing the circumstances. The main character continued to conceal the truth, insisting that he had merely made an educated guess. However, Xiao Xiao remained skeptical and inquired whether he could genuinely deduce such intricate details, as it appeared they ought to relocate and engage in a conversation over tea. All eyes were fixed upon him, and the main character considered this girl to be exceptionally astute, which was far from favorable. Abruptly, Yer emerged amidst the crowd and inquired of the protagonist about the situation. He was taken aback, inquiring why she was present. The female officer was equally astonished and inquired whether she was acquainted with the main character, clarified that her vehicle had malfunctioned and that she was transporting it to the service center. She inched a bit nearer and inquired once more about what was transpiring with him. Bai Wu believed he understood that this woman was typically quite composed and aloof. Nevertheless, in this circumstance, her manner of speaking resembled that of someone who had discovered another's infidelity. However, unexpectedly, he perceived a significant prospect in that. He gestured playfully at her, and she felt a bit taken aback. He hurried over to her, grasped her hand, and exclaimed that it was not what she presumed. He crouched before her, insisting that he was entirely uninvolved with that lady. All those in proximity were astonished by that demeanor, and Bai Wu exclaimed, gesturing towards Xiao Xiao, asserting that she was the individual who refused to allow him any solitude. He informed Xiao Xiao that they hardly acquainted. Furthermore, he cherished his girlfriend deeply and requested that she cease her disturbances. Xiao Xiao felt a sense of shame, asserting that the situation wasn't entirely as it appeared. Those surrounding them inquired if this was indeed an infidelity debacle unfolding before their eyes, as it was quite thrilling. By the looks of it, that gentleman had taken his mistress to purchase a vehicle and was caught in the act by his spouse, and judging by the wife's demeanor, she was likely seething with rage. Xiao Xiao grew exasperated and inquired of the protagonist who was truly troubling whom. Bai Wu grasped Ye's arm, asserting that she had observed it firsthand, and that this woman was the one obstructing his departure. Yu comprehended the circumstances and went along with it, claiming that he was her partner and requesting Xiao Xiao to cease troubling him. All became thrilled, and Xiao Xiao felt both shame and anger due to that circumstance. The main character believed that he had already arrived at this juncture, and now he could no longer retreat. Xiao Xiao gazed at Bai Wu and became overwhelmed, striking him. As he crouched in agony on the floor, Xiao Xiao turned and departed. Bai passed Yi, expressing her lack of interest in that young man, but cautioned her to remain vigilant, as her partner might not be of good character. He inquired about Bai Wu's well-being. He rose and expressed his gratitude, mentioning that despite the substantial cost, he had ultimately succeeded in resolving that issue for the time being, and she had been instrumental in achieving that. She beamed and remarked that the main character had previously assisted her, and he might regard that as her expression of remorse for entangling him in that predicament previously. However, within that crowd, Qingqing was also observing the main character conversing with Yi while exchanging smiles. She grew so envious that she declared if the main character troubled her partner once more, she would unequivocally ensure he did not evade her grasp this time. The following day, Bai Wu contemplated that romantic entanglements rendered champions vulnerable, and if he continued to engage with those youthful ladies, he would be incapable of accomplishing anything else. Thus, in the times ahead, he ought to steer clear of them, to minimize complications, and concentrate on earning his wealth, as in existence, all else was merely an illusion. Only currency held true substance. He made his way back to Antique Street, yet Qingqing was trailing behind him. Joyfully, he mused that the day prior he had deduced he would uncover a treasure today, and this cadence felt reminiscent. He proceeded to the familiar stand, but upon his arrival, he was astonished to find that Wang was absent. The merchant who consistently remained by his side affirmed that this was indeed the situation, as they had mentioned their intention to venture into the countryside in search of some treasures, yet Wang had already been missing for several days. He inquired of the Golden Finger whether the riches he would discover that day would not be linked to Wang, and the Golden Finger proclaimed it was completely certain. He stressed that this was of little consequence, and inquired of the other vendor where he might locate Wang. However, the Golden Finger indicated 0%, which astonished the protagonist, causing him to contemplate its significance. He inquired of his capability whether this indicated that he would be unable to discover a treasure that day, and the system indicated that was precisely correct. Nevertheless, the main character felt somewhat disoriented, as this was in stark contrast to what had been settled the day before. This likely indicated the presence of a hidden treasure, yet he would be unable to uncover it. Bai Wu resolved to overlook all of that, as his primary focus was to locate Wang before attending to any other concerns. Qingting persisted in observing every action the protagonist took. Half an hour later, he proceeded to a different booth and discovered an object that was entirely genuine. He inquired of the vendor the price of that item. The trader claimed it was priced at 3,000, but if the main character appreciated it so highly, he could offer him a 5% reduction. However, Bai Wu expressed dissatisfaction and suggested that perhaps a 50% reduction would be more fitting. The vendor beamed and expressed his concurrence with the 50% reduction. Bai Wu believed that yet again, the proprietor was unaware of the actual value of that item. Nevertheless, he perceived it as somewhat odd, as he had just discovered a bounty, yet his capacity still indicated defeat. Qingting showed up, stating that she would purchase it for the initial price of 3,000. Bai Wu Wu regarded this as a remarkable happenstance. The vendor acted promptly and presented it to the young lady. He advised the vendor to avoid rushing, as they had to proceed systematically, and proposed 10,000. However, Qing Ting elevated it to 30,000. Bai Wu became aware that she was doing it intentionally. The vendor now considered the bronze furnace to be quite precious and was reluctant to part with it. Bai Wu chuckled and declared that he proposed 50,000, stressing that if she placed a greater offer, then that worthless item would belong to her. However, Qing Ting merely stated that she proposed 100,000 and inquired about the protagonist's opinion regarding that. Bai Wu came to understand that he could not mislead that young woman and may have to continue increasing the cost. Qing Ting merely considered that if he wished to continue participating, she was indifferent, as acquiring that worthless item would hold no significance for her. The main character stated that it was acceptable and highlighted that she had triumphed. As he departed, he contemplated that she had placed a wager evidently focused on the item, indicating that her aim was him, rather than acquiring that object. Moreover, he would be foolish if he continued to bid and challenged her directly. The system indicated that persisting with the bids was futile, recommending he assess the success rate instead. However, he grew annoyed and instructed the system to be quiet. The moment Qing Ting grasped the fragment, she observed that it genuinely resembled a genuine artifact from the Ming dynasty. And judging by appearances, Bai Wu truly was peculiar. She persisted in trailing him. The main character inquired whether she had completed her shopping, but she merely disregarded him, asserting that this street was not his domain. He approached a different booth and discovered an article priced at 100,000, but she surpassed the cost by proposing 200,000, and this occurred repeatedly. Eventually, he grew so exasperated that he inquired if she was present solely to provoke him, but she merely smiled, suggesting that perhaps it was due to her faith in the protagonist's discernment. Yet it was clear that he could intentionally inflate the prices or even opt for merely counterfeit items. Nevertheless, she possessed ample wealth and was indifferent to that. She advanced, stating that he was the young man who had just reached 20 years of age and hailed from Tongqing, originated from a typical household, and was presently on hiatus. Even though he had purchased a premier automobile the previous day, she inquired if his abrupt affluence was perhaps a tad too rapid. Bai Wu probed whether she was genuinely scrutinizing him and underscored that he was merely a common lad attempting to seize opportunities and discover some valuables. This constituted legitimate earnings, and he had not engaged in any illicit activities. Qing Ting remarked that it was acceptable. Following the previous occasion, he claimed to possess the ability to foresee events and estimated that he could unearth a treasure independently. That was quite remarkable. However, based on her inquiry, he had been quite unremarkable for the initial 2 decades and additionally possessed no familial legacy in that area. She stressed that she was unaware of the maneuvers he had employed and doubted whether he genuinely believed he could attain the pinnacle of existence merely by desiring it, as that was a lamentable squandering. She underscored that the manner in which he had achieved it was inconsequential, but she could assure one thing. From that moment forward, she had severed his route to prosperity. Therefore, he ought to refrain from contemplating any attempts to break free from mediocrity from that moment forward. Bai Wu was taken aback, inquiring whether it was truly an offense to aspire to be exceptional, and asserted that he understood the course of action he needed to take. She persisted in believing that she wielded authority and urged him to speak, inquiring if he felt apprehensive, since he had become mute after she declared her intention to sever his financial resources. The main character, on the verge of losing his composure, shouted at her, accusing her of intentionally inflating prices, obstructing his ability to earn income, and pointing out that he had been magnanimous by refraining from confronting her. And now she asserted that she would sever his route to prosperity. She inquired whether he truly did not think she was capable of accomplishing that. The main character insisted that it was unfeasible for her to engage in such an act and turned to leave. However, she persisted in trailing him, remarking that, judging by his expression, he seemed incredulous, but she was determined to ensure he would not make a dime. Bai Wu meticulously examined the elements in his vicinity, and she believed that as long as he purchased an item, she would place a more substantial offer to acquire it. Thus, she was eager to observe his capabilities. Bai Wu gazed at a vendor, initiated a salutation, drew near to him, and murmured softly into his ear. She speculated that he was likely getting ready to make a purchase, and now it was her moment to demonstrate how to obstruct his route to prosperity. However, Bai Wu merely departed without making any purchases, leaving her somewhat perplexed by the circumstance. He repeated this numerous times. Qing Ting felt disoriented, pondering his actions, as he was merely conversing with all the vendors without making any purchases. He inquired of the golden digit regarding the success probability of his strategy, and the response was a complete 100%. He chuckled and declared that the moment had arrived for him to take action. He summoned everyone and informed the manager vendors that he intended to purchase all the items in their stores. Qing Ting believed he was strategizing to uncover a hidden treasure within the establishments, and to deter her from creating any issues, he had intentionally employed volume to obscure his true intentions. She inquired of the main character whether he genuinely thought this could prevent her, for if he held that belief, he was merely a simpleton. Bai Wu merely grinned, stating that if the supervisors had no reservations, they could finalize the deal at this moment. However, she intervened, requesting them to pause, and expressed her desire to acquire everything from all the stores. The main character urged her not to overstate. She underscored that whatever he attempted to purchase, she would propose a higher bid. Thus, his route to affluence was entirely obstructed. The main character highlighted that he was aware of her considerable wealth. Nevertheless, all those vendors possessed an extensive inventory, and pondered whether she truly had the means to acquire all of it, or if she was merely posturing to intimidate him. Qing Ting grew annoyed, inquiring whether he genuinely sought to belittle her, and challenging what authority he possessed to act in such a manner. She merely requested that they declare the overall cost of all items in the store, as she intended to provide an additional 10%. All observed. However, she readied herself to finalize the transaction, stating that everyone would profit, thus they needed to expedite the process. A brief time later, she dispatched the payment to all, and one of the vendors instructed her to furnish an address so they could dispatch all the items. Qing Ting straightforwardly instructed them to provide an address or a card, as she intended to request her butler to visit them and collect the items. Following this, after completing the acquisition, she directed her gaze towards the main character and inquired about the whereabouts of all the hubris he had displayed previously, for it appeared that she could indeed obstruct his route to riches at her discretion. Yet Bai Wu merely continued to chuckle and sauntered by her. He approached the vendors, and they unanimously declared that he was an outstanding salesperson. As per their arrangement, the entire sum was divided equally, 50% for each party, and they would initiate the transfer without delay. He embraced the vendors, who proceeded to express that they had already remitted the funds, and that if he had any additional positive updates in the future, he was welcome to return to them once more. Qing Ting became enraged when she observed Bai Wu displaying all the transactions, approached the vendors, and inquired whether they had been collaborating. The main character stated that was precisely correct, as he had previously been roaming the vintage market, seeking merchants who were interested in collaborating. To simplify the entire strategy, she was rash and quickly infuriated, and she completed the transaction immediately after he incited her. Furthermore, at that moment, just as he had previously asserted, his journey to affluence could not be hindered by an individual of limited intellect. Qing Ting became enraged and remarked that it was a wise decision. However, he ought to keep it in mind. The main character continued to chuckle and expressed, wishing her a pleasant journey and hoping she doesn't let the door slam behind her as she departs. Abruptly, he observed an occurrence taking place. A display manifested in front of him, indicating that the system upgrade was underway. He was astonished, pondering what this might entail. Abruptly, the update concluded, and the system announced that he could harness his creativity to complete the most imaginative and astonishing sentence. As he departed, he contemplated that despite having gained a benefit from that young woman, just as she had indicated, her lineage was extensive and influential, and he could not contend with that. He had anticipated that the system would evolve into something remarkable, yet there had been no transformation, and he required it to comprehend a bit more about the disparity. Furthermore, his power was significantly insufficient at that time. He was deficient in relationships and monetary assets to generate substantial income, thus requiring him to broaden his network further. Yet he remained uncertain about how he ought to accomplish that, since, as he neared the vehicle, he noticed a gentleman positioned beside it. The gentleman inquired if he was Bai Wu and presented himself, stating that he was the steward of Miss Qing Ting. The main character inquired whether he had arrived to seek retribution for her loss, as he was likely a covertly skilled combatant or an ex-special forces operative. However, the steward indicated that this was not entirely accurate, as his mistress intended to extend an invitation to him for a soiree of prominent individuals as a gesture of contrition for the miscommunication. Bai Wu felt somewhat wary, contemplating that she might have hidden agendas. Nevertheless, he could seize this chance to connect with prominent individuals and broaden his network subsequently. He informed the steward that there was no issue, as he consented to depart. Several hours later, he showed up at the designated location, and she stood at the entrance, expressing her belief that he would not arrive. The main character underscored that although it was an unfriendly gathering, Liu Bang emerged unscathed, so what was there to fear? Qing Ting requested that he accompany her, as she wished to present him to several individuals. She presented him with 3 individuals, asserting that the fair-haired one was the prospective heir of the Shanghai conglomerate young Master Wang. The individual in the center was Mr. Zhou, the leader of Xingchuang Technology, and finally, Madame Liu, the chief executive officer of Yifu media. She was confident that he was already familiar with them. Bai Wu was taken aback, believing that each of them were truly prominent individuals, and in reality, he felt a twinge of anxiety in their presence. This must be what is referred to as self-conscious inadequacy. She grinned, believing that this was precisely what one would anticipate from an unrefined upstart as he grew uneasy in the presence of prominent individuals. Now she would witness firsthand how else he might be degraded. However, the main character came to the understanding that her sole desire was to make him look foolish. Nevertheless, the harder he tried to avoid feeling anxious, the more apprehensive he grew, and if this persisted, he would certainly humiliate himself. Abruptly, he grasped the circumstances and perceived that he was indifferent to powerful individuals, because each of them consumed food and beverages and required a trip to the restroom. Therefore, he merely had to envision them all in the lavatory, which would alleviate his anxiety. Bai Wu beamed and welcomed them, expressing that it was a delight to encounter them, and presented himself by name. Qing Ting was taken aback, pondering how he had abruptly transformed into such a serene state. After 5 minutes, the two approached a table, and she remarked that he had performed exceptionally. What astonished her considerably was his ability to engage with prominent individuals so effortlessly. The main character highlighted that prominent individuals were not dissimilar to everyday individuals. Qing Ting stressed that the distinction between categories was not readily apparent to the unaided eye. Unexpectedly, an individual descended beneath the platform and informed all the attendees that they would now proceed to the primary focus of that venue's assembly, which was the philanthropic auction. The main character was taken aback by this. Qing Ting grinned, referred to him as a rural simpleton, and inquired if he truly required her to clarify what it entailed. The protagonist employed a well-known adage, indicating that he did not require an elucidation, for although he had never consumed pork, he had observed pigs in motion. Thus he understood perfectly what a charity auction signified. Qing Ting gazed at him, expressing that this was truly remarkable, and displayed a container indicating that within it was a ceramic vessel from the Ming dynasty, and she intended to put it up for bid at that auction. She shoved the container onto the table, asserting that he was a vintage specialist, thus he could assist her in evaluating it for the sale. Bai Wu inquired whether she genuinely desired him to proceed with that and pondered what advantages it would yield for him. Qing Ting underscored that her actions were solely for philanthropic purposes, and if he wished, the auction could be conducted under his name. She inquired whether he had not mentioned his desire to amass considerable wealth, for if he genuinely aspired to achieve that, cultivating a positive reputation among powerful individuals would greatly advantage him in the long run. Bai Wu believed that this was quite logical. Each individual present held significant sway, and ensuring they recall him would genuinely assist in broadening his connections down the line. Nevertheless, he continued to be wary, expressing that something felt amiss, and inquired why she would intentionally seek to assist him. Qing Ting remarked that it was quite straightforward, as it was preferable to settle grievances rather than allow them to persist, and she wished to avoid any undue discomfort between them. The main character stayed vigilant, believing he could not rely on that woman, as she was likely plotting some kind of deception. He inquired about the authenticity of his capability, yet his capability indicated that the genuineness was entirely verified, contingent upon an extra stipulation. Furthermore, the latest transaction amount was $12,500,000. Recognizing that the artifact was indeed genuine, he inquired whether the auction might be a disappointment, but the probability of achievement was guaranteed. He believed that both the vintage item and the bidding event would thrive, thus he had no reason for concern, and judging by appearances, he had been overthinking prior to taking any steps. Even if she possessed a plan, he had the framework, so he had no reason to be apprehensive. Qing Ting readied to reclaim the box, inquiring if he concurred, as it was perfectly acceptable if he preferred not to. The main character grasped the box, stating that he was in agreement and relished performing kind acts. The broadcaster announced that the upcoming item would be the last offering in that philanthropic auction. Bai Wu gazed at Qing Ting, who bore a rather peculiar countenance, which led him to believe that there was likely something peculiar underlying all of this. The auctioneer announced that this piece was being offered by Mr. Bai Wu. The main character reflected that he had already ventured too far, and that further contemplation at this point was futile. The artifact was genuine, and the auction boasted a flawless success rate, prompting him to discover what cunning she might employ. He positioned the container on the surface, and announced his name to all, expressing that it was a delight to encounter them. Yet, immediately after he lifted the cover of the container, it uncovered a cylinder of bathroom tissue, departing him astonished. Individuals started ridiculing the scenario, inquiring whether the coordinators had introduced that to invigorate the ambience. The main character believed he had anticipated that it wouldn't be that straightforward, thus this was her scheme all along. He endeavored to envision the moment she had exchanged it, as the artifact had had undergone examination and was confirmed to be entirely authentic. He recalled that she had mentioned her earring had dropped and requested him to retrieve it. The moment he stooped, it was likely then that she had exchanged the containers. He believed that this was a profoundly intricate tactic, as she was chuckling while observing that circumstance. The auctioneer further ridiculed him, inquiring whether the main character had been rushed to use the restroom and had inadvertently ascended the stage with toilet tissue. Ching was relishing the occasion, believing that this time she had succeeded in making him look foolish. Nevertheless, the main character believed he could not allow this to pass easily, for if he fled at this moment, it would signify succumbing entirely to the scheme she had devised. Consequently, he had to devise a method to rectify the predicament. Should everything crumble, gossip would proliferate, and he would be unable to sustain his profession. Certain individuals continued to chuckle, asserting that if he had no presentation to deliver, he ought to vacate the stage, as they were merely gazing at a fool. Another individual requested the host to remove the main participant, as they needed to proceed. The auctioneer suggested that perhaps Bai Wu should take a break and remove some perspiration. The main character grew exasperated, believing he could not just concede failure in such a manner. Thus, he would fully commit and fervently wager on what had to be accomplished. He focused intently since the auction's success rate had reached a remarkable 100%, indicating there must be a solution. Nevertheless, he believed that the success rate was not the sole factor. In circumstances like this, all he could do was depend on his resourcefulness. All those years spent crafting novels had not been in vain, so he had to harness his imagination. He grasped the tissue roll in his hand, stating that in the perspective of many, this may merely be an incomplete roll of toilet tissue, yet for him, it represented the most invaluable present. The individuals ceased their conversations and started focusing. Ting grew anxious, attempting to speculate what sort of ruse that individual was orchestrating this time. The main character remarked that while he may appear robust and formidable at this time, in reality, he had been quite sensitive during his younger years, enduring harassment and intimidation from his peers. He consistently returned home in tears, and his mother attempted to uplift his spirits, as it was his birthday and they were enjoying longevity noodles. Due to his family's dire financial situation, his father presented him with a roll of toilet paper as a birthday present. The main character stressed that he was quite young and unable to comprehend the gesture, prompting him to inquire why his father would offer him toilet paper as a gift. His father, possessing vast wisdom, patted his head and remarked that he had become a man, and men may bleed, yet they do not weep. Consequently, he desired the main character to harness that talent as inspiration. Whenever he found himself unable to restrain his tears, he should utilize it to dry his eyes, as his father firmly believed in his capabilities. This caused the main character to perceive the world from a new perspective, fostering a belief that he might evolve into an individual of significance in the future, possessing a fraction of the masculinity his father bore within him. He underscored that shortly thereafter, his parents tragically lost their lives in an accident. His family was extremely impoverished, and all he received was a mountain of debts represented by that roll of toilet paper. He inhaled deeply and recalled his father's advice, consistently reminding himself to refrain from tears. However, the challenges of existence could only be truly comprehended through lived experiences. With tears glistening in his eyes and his hand quaking, he lifted his face and expressed that whenever he sensed he could no longer persevere, he would rip off a fragment of that roll of toilet tissue to erase his tears and remind himself that he needed to be more resilient. In this manner, gradually, he had arrived at that location and secured the privilege to attend that auction. Thus, that partial roll of toilet paper stood as a testament to his hardships and accomplishments, alongside all his setbacks and sorrow. As a result, at that crucial time, he was prepared to sell something exceedingly valuable to him, a sheet of toilet paper, to support a charitable cause and assist others in securing their rightful place in society. All laughter ceased, and a hush enveloped the room. Ting was astonished and perceived that, judging by his expression, that young man was unaware of the nature of this place to attempt such an act. Nevertheless, all remained silent, and she believed that it had not made a significant impact. The main character continuously surveyed the surroundings and contemplated that there truly would be no offer or response. Abruptly, an individual started clapping, expressing that the narrative was rather intriguing and that he appreciated the main character, thus he would offer $100,000. Bai Wu experienced a sense of ease, and the auctioneer declared it was purchased. With that, the bidding would be finalized. The main character was struck by the auctioneer's admirable skills, as he adeptly navigated the circumstances and brought the proceedings to a close. Shaking with anxiety, he considered himself fortunate to be a writer, capable of conjuring a narrative to escape any predicament. Otherwise, he would have faced utter embarrassment. Ting rose to depart, and the main character gazed at her, inquiring whether she genuinely believed he would feel debased, as he had successfully navigated the predicament. Ting continued to be vexed and remarked that he had merely experienced fortune on this occasion, but on the next, he may not be as fortunate. She departed, and he exhaled a breath of relief, believing that while he had preserved his standing, his strategy to connect with prominent individuals had been utterly thwarted. He walked to the parking area, contemplating that despite having navigated that predicament by fabricating a tale, in their perception, he had merely been a fool. Thus, he had to concede that the individual who emerged triumphant this time was Qingting. Without her presence, no one would take notice of him. At this point, he needed to exert considerable effort to earn income, for with wealth arrived prestige and respect. Unexpectedly, an opulent vehicle sped by him. Bai Wu was astonished, curious about why the high-profile individual who had purchased his toilet paper had departed with the year. He inquired why they were united, and the system indicated that she maintained a commercial collaboration with the other party, and the two families were on the verge of being united through matrimony. Bai Wu was astonished, pondering the sudden increase in intellect within the system, speculating that it might be attributed to the recent update. However, having become aware of the union, he ultimately comprehended the reason behind Qingting's behavior. The realm of the affluent was indeed intricate, so he ought to cease attempting to engage, as the priority was to concentrate on generating wealth. Furthermore, he ought to seek assistance from individuals within the antique community, as this was the group with which he had prior experience. He recalled Wang and considered that, in reality, he felt a slight sense of longing for him. Curious if he might have discovered another valuable bounty lately. The system indicated that Wang Pengzi could possess an additional treasure to gather. Henceforth, he would refer to the vendor as Pengzi. The main character grinned, reflecting on how remarkable this individual was, as he consistently discovered treasures. However, it was the main character who amassed wealth. Thus, it might be even more advantageous if he established a collaboration with that person. He possessed associations within the vintage community and was remarkably articulate, allowing him to assume the forefront in situations where it would be troublesome for Bai Wu to advance. Thus, with Pengzi's assistance, his prospects in the realm of antiques would significantly improve. Consequently, he was required to undertake this action. The following day at his booth, Pengzi received a telephone call inquiring why he had not arrived yet, but abruptly learned that, indeed, they had been anticipating his arrival for a considerable duration. Subsequently, the main character drew near. Pengzi grew annoyed and inquired what purpose he served in that place, deeming him unfortunate as he had nothing remaining to trade. Bai Wu urged him to temper his anger, as he had come to discuss a collaboration. Pengzi inquired about the nature of this collaboration. Bai Wu clarified that the trader's fortune was considerable, and he consistently stumbled upon valuable items. Bai Wu remarked that his keen vision could invariably discern genuine gems, thus suggesting that if they collaborated, it would be a beneficial alliance. Bai Wu clarified that if they established a collaboration, they could divide the earnings equally, and inquired about the merchant's perspective on the matter. Pengzi, vexed, remarked that the main character had triumphed over him on 2 occasions, signifying that he had consumed the flesh and sipped the broth, scarcely allowing him the bowl to savor. Thus, how did he have the audacity to arrive there to discuss a collaboration? Pengzi stressed that the main character was likely present solely to deride him and urge him to depart, as he no longer wished to engage in that discussion. Bai Wu recognized that he continued to harbor resentment regarding the events of the previous 2 occasions and remained quite furious. Therefore, if the main character persisted in that issue, circumstances might spiral beyond control. Bai Wu believed that his objective was not to confront him, so perhaps he should withdraw for the time being. Regardless, there would be chances to seize him in the future, and eventually he would be entirely at his mercy. As Bai Wu was departing, 2 additional individuals approached Pengzi and initiated a conversation about a particular topic. The main character observed this and considered that maybe Pengzi was facing significant difficulties. Pengzi expressed his desire to witness the items they had available for purchase. The elderly gentleman appeared dubious, but displayed the blade. The other vendor underscored that he had personally examined it, and it was unequivocally Cao Cao's 7-star sword. Pengzi commenced examining the blade, yet the main character continued to watch, believing that this narrative was rather embellished. Nevertheless, he observed that the tradesman was scrutinizing intently and inquired about his capacity to ascertain whether that blade was authentic. However, the system cautioned that it was entirely fraudulent. Pengzi completed the examination and highlighted that the object was authentically real, requesting them to specify their asking price. Bai Wu considered the trader to be utterly foolish for his desire to purchase a counterfeit, or perhaps that blade was crafted with such excellence that even the trader had failed to perceive it. He inquired about the likelihood of Pengzi unraveling that deception, and the system indicated it was at 0%. The main character recognized that Pengzi possessed considerable expertise, and if he could be deceived by that blade, it indicated that the craftsmanship craftsmanship was exceptionally advanced. However, regrettably, it could not outwit his keen gaze. Nevertheless, he was unaware of the issue with that blade as he was unable to perceive it. Abruptly, the system altered once more and revealed certain specifics that had not been previously displayed. Consequently, he scrutinized every aspect yet disregarded the ornament and the precious stone, as Pongzi possessed considerable expertise. And if it were that straightforward, he certainly would have observed it right away. Thus, the imperfection was likely located beneath the precious stone. Bai Wu believed that by assisting him at this moment, he could avoid being indebted to him, yet it was the moment to disclose the techniques he genuinely employed. Given that his intellect was sufficient to contrive against him, those two insignificant crooks ought not to entertain the notion at all. Bai Wu approached the trio, and Pongzi grew somewhat annoyed. However, Bai Wu stated that it was acceptable and urged him to cease concealing the sword. He inquired whether that SSR grade 7-star sword was genuinely at its peak level, considering that every novice player was given one. Pongzi inquired about the significance of his statement. Bai Wu stated that it was precisely what it appeared to be. Pongzi grew frustrated and stated that he had meticulously inspected the blade, considering its form and state, along with the patina and imperfections, and found everything to be entirely impeccable. Furthermore, he had been immersed in the antiquities realm for over 10 years, so how could the main character believe he was unable to discern between the genuine and the counterfeit? Pongzi believed that this was merely a scheme the main character was concocting to attempt to snatch his blade and pondered whether there existed some sort of animosity for such an event to transpire. Bai Wu inquired about the consequences of demonstrating that the sword was counterfeit, suggesting that if he succeeded, Pongzi might choose to accompany him from that point forward. Pongzi inquired about the consequences if the blade were genuine, as he was disinterested in the main character. Bai Wu questioned the merchant regarding the price he was asking for that sword. Pongzi grew increasingly annoyed, asserting that it was clear the main character was inquiring about the cost because he intended to usurp the transaction. The vendor stated that his asking price was $500,000. Bai Wu asserted that should he be mistaken, he would incur a cost tenfold greater, implying the amount would escalate to $5 million. Pongzi promptly acquiesced and presented the blade to the protagonist, stating that because he had made the promise, he must honor his commitment. He requested Master Bai to advance before the crowd and reveal to all how that blade might be counterfeit. Bai Wu grasped the blade and instructed them to observe closely, as he intended to impart a brief lesson to all. He retrieved a container from the earth, inquiring if it was a practical and ideal tool for all. Pongzi questioned what his intentions were with it. The main character struck the blade firm and struck a rock to the earth, departing from all individuals. Astonished, Pongzi grew annoyed and inquired if the protagonist had lost their senses. Bai Wu examined the origin of that precious stone's descent and started chuckling, wondering if that foolish buffoon would still have the audacity to continue defying him now. He displayed the blade and inquired whether QR codes were present during the era of the Three Kingdoms. Pongzi was unable to comprehend it, and the main character inquired whether he was now prepared to accompany him, as he was the genuine authority on antiquities. Pongzi grew increasingly exasperated by the predicament, as the duo had genuinely been attempting to mislead him. He inquired whether the two of them had grown weary of existence, but the moment he glanced to the side, he understood they had vanished. He continued to yell, asserting that they were fortunate to have evaded capture, and that if he encountered them once more, they would face consequences. Pongzi gazed at the main character and inquired how he discerned that the sword was counterfeit, wondering if it was feasible that he had employed those two. Bai Wu inquired whether he was genuinely paying attention to what he had merely posed, for if he were able to acquire items of such caliber, then why would he have sought out Pongzi to establish a collaboration? And regarding how he came upon it, he once overheard a sagacious individual remark that each person possessed their own techniques, which ought not to be divulged. Pongzi remarked that perhaps it was preferable to disregard that circumstance, as he truly did not wish to listen to it. The main character asserted that if he recalled correctly, there had been a consensus regarding the wager prior to his revelation that the blade was counterfeit, and since he had emerged victorious, the traitor would be obligated to accompany him. However, Pongzi declined, expressing that the protagonist was overly intricate and he could not discern the full extent of the situation, which left him somewhat apprehensive about being deceived. He stressed that the main character ought to seek another individual for this collaboration. Bai Wu clarified that Pongzi was being somewhat irrational regarding all of this. Pongzi clarified that he earned his livelihood in the vintage market and genuinely possessed a sense of integrity, whereas the prominent figures in the industry merely fabricated stories and lacked any moral principles. The main character was astonished to discover the significant personalities within the sector. The traitor persisted in his rejection, suggesting that perhaps it would be more prudent to abandon the entire alliance concept. Nevertheless, he recalled all his obligations efforts and acts of kindness. Therefore, he could not allow the protagonist's assistance to go unreciprocated. He mentioned that the main character could select anything from his stand as a token of gratitude for the assistance he had just provided. Bai Wu inquired about the nature of this debris. Pongzi grew agitated, asserting that all those valuables had been amassed by him personally, and requested the main character to examine it, stating that this was the kasaya donned by the esteemed Xuanzang during his expedition to the west. The main character inquired whether he had pilfered that outfit from a theatrical group, as it still bore scorch marks from cigarettes. Pongzi grew somewhat concerned regarding that circumstance and resolved to swap objects, presenting him with a sizable basin that Wu Song had utilized for drinking prior to battling the leopard at Jinyang Ridge. The central character underscored that it resembled a dish from the noodle eatery located on the same avenue and pondered whether he was genuinely able to locate a trustworthy product. Pongzi recognized that nothing was effective. He proclaimed that he would truly display his most valued possession and started rummaging through his belongings. The main character continued to observe, contemplating that there was an abundance of clutter present and that the trader was faring quite poorly. Upon reflecting deeply, he had indeed outsmarted Pongzi and amassed wealth on multiple occasions. Thus, it was hardly surprising that he harbored such a significant resentment. After a brief period, Pongzi ultimately discovered what he had been seeking. Bai Wu inquired about what it was on this occasion and if he had appropriated it from an elderly gentleman performing morning exercises in the park. Pongzi declared that he would now enlighten the main character, as this was the dual plume blade wielded by Liu Bei, Lu Xuanda from the era of the Three Kingdoms. Unexpectedly, the system successfully validated the sword and cautioned that the proprietor was being identified as Liu Bei, yet a message emerged stating that it could not authenticate this. The main character was astonished and inquired if it was genuinely authentic. Pongzi affirmed, yet he was unable to provide it to the main character as he was relying on it to make a comeback in the marketplace. Bai Wu speculated that judging by appearances, the corpulent man's prized possession was indeed that blade, and fate truly favored him. The central character conceived a notion, believing that this served as a launching pad and with it, he could authentically encounter that individual. Thus, he sought a means to acquire that blade. Pongzi inquired whether the main character had completed the search for what he desired, for if he genuinely believed that no riches existed in that place, he would be astounded. Bai Wu underscored that initially it was Cao Cao's 7-star sword and now Liu Bei's twin feather blade. Judging by the circumstances, he truly was contending with the Three Kingdoms at this moment. Pongzi started urging the main character to examine the form, the state, and the exquisite sheen. Bai Wu interjected, stating that the trader had expressed a similar sentiment regarding the 7-star sword previously. Pongzi started to feel somewhat anxious. The main character inched a bit nearer, inquiring if he might deduce that, from its appearance, this blade also possessed a cipher. Pongzi gazed at the 7-star blade on the floor and felt disheartened. He gazed at the blade in his grasp, reflecting on how the attributes of this sword and the prior one were remarkably alike, and that the craftsmen were indeed exceptionally talented. Distressed, he underscored that he had believed he could gather the arms of Liu Bei and Cao Cao and vend them for an exorbitant sum, but everything had unraveled. Annoyed, he started brandishing the sword in his grasp, proclaiming that he had been misled repeatedly and, by the looks of it, he would soon be struck by lightning as well. Bai Wu grasped the blade, declaring that the vendor now appeared quite pitiable, thus he would assist him. The main character asserted that he would retain the blade and request the merchant to specify his cost, as he would not haggle and would pay any amount he demanded. Pongzi, who was already disheartened, remarked that he had mentioned the lead character could select anything, allowing him to seize the sword and depart. Bai Wu expressed her gratitude to him for that. Upon his departure, he recognized that Pongzi appeared truly miserable and deeply sorrowful. Thus, he had to seek an opportunity that would allow him to secure a substantial gain. Otherwise, the main character would feel somewhat regretful about the entire scenario. As a result, he longed for the opportunity to have encountered the elder Mr. Che during that time. However, he was a prominent figure in the realm of antiques, and an insubstantial present would not suffice for him. Inside that circle, there existed a pyramid. At the apex were the enigmatic purchasers. Following them were the prominent achievements of the sector, where Mr. Yong Kong presently resided. Just beneath that tier were the emerging powers of the industry, which was where the protagonist had currently positioned himself. Next in line were the seasoned professionals of that field, where Pongzi was situated. At the base of it all were the novices of the industry, individuals who were misled or merely beginning their journeys, thus acquiring items at inflated costs. Bai Wu believed that with the twin feather sword in his possession, he could present it to old Che, for this truly was a prized possession that had located its deserving custodian. He traveled to the gazebo, yet prior to stepping inside, he reflected that he genuinely wished to avoid encountering that bothersome Zhou Xiao once more. He stepped into the store, where a woman woman was tidying up a few items. He approached her and inquired whether old Che was there. The young woman grinned and expressed her regrets, stating that her supervisor was preoccupied at the present time and unable to welcome guests. The main character inquired of the system whether it was conceivable that Yong Kong would desire to meet him if he were aware of the true situation. Furthermore, the system responded affirmatively. Therefore, the main character requested the lady to notify Mr. Che that the individual who sold the Tang Sankai previously was paying him another visit. The lady was taken aback and replied that it was acceptable, requesting the main character to hold on for just a moment as she would notify him promptly. Out of the blue, an individual inquired whether he truly was the person who had sold the Tang Sankai to his grandfather. The main character was taken aback and considered it rather pitiful to dread precisely what was about to occur. Bai Wu behaved courteously and referred to her as Miss, expressing that they had ultimately reunited. However, Xiao Xiao was already preparing herself, and the main character grew terrified, inquiring about what was happening. She subsequently gazes at the main character and states that by merging past and present resentments, she is determined to impart a valuable lesson to him at this moment. The system illuminated a red alert indicating a crisis and notified him that the likelihood of sustaining an injury that would prevent him from standing was absolute. Xiao Xiao attempted to strike him, yet the main character evaded and fled. She seized a vase and inquired about his destination, attempting to hurl it at him. However, her grandfather emerged furiously before her, halting her just in the nick of time. He exclaimed, inquiring what absurdity she was engaged in at that moment, and commanded her to set the vase down without delay. The elderly gentleman stressed that the situation was becoming increasingly unruly, instructing her to return home and contemplate her behavior. As she was unable to defy her grandfather, she ultimately complied, but cautioned the main character that he merely had to bide his time and urged him to avoid any further encounters with the other two outside, or else he would not be so fortunate. Bai Wu observed her depart from the gazebo, believing he had successfully averted a calamity. Nevertheless, he did not anticipate that she would depart so docilely. She stepped outside, declaring that she would not depart in such a manner and would remain there. Yong Kong expressed his regrets on behalf of his granddaughter, stating that the main character was exhibiting great humility due to having been indulged by her grandmother, which had led to her current naivety. Bai Wu responded with a smile, remarking that she was a remarkably straightforward and sincere individual, possessing a robust personality, and that such traits were indeed advantageous for anyone. Nonetheless, the main character observed that the demeanor of that elderly man's visage revealed that he harbored a thought. The system informed him that it could solely evaluate success rates and was unable to discern thoughts. Bai Wu speculated that, judging by appearances, the system upgrade had merely enhanced its capacity to whine. Yong Kong requested the main character to accompany him, as they could converse more harmoniously in the tea chamber on the upper level of the pavilion. Upon entering the chamber, the main character was captivated and remarked that the tea room was genuinely exceptional. Yong Kong expressed his gratitude for the praise and remarked that those were merely a few arbitrary objects he had positioned there, as he found it difficult to showcase them. Bai Wu believed that the elderly gentleman was being quite humble, as the belongings within that chamber were evidently intended for display. Yong Kong served some tea and underscored that if the main character was paying a visit, it likely indicated he had discovered yet another gem. Bai Wu presented the blade and invited Yong Kong to examine it. He was astonished and grinned, expressing that it appeared to be a relic from the Eastern Han era. The main character underscored that commonplace objects did not merit Yong Kong's keen gaze, and only treasures of such caliber were befitting of a triumphant individual like himself. The elderly gentleman underscored that a set of Eastern Han Dynasty blades in such a state would presently command approximately 5 million at a sale. Bai Wu inquired about the value it would hold if it were the blade of Emperor Zhaoli. Yong Kong underscored that if it were an artifact employed by Duke Zhaoli during his youth, the worth would be tenfold greater. Bai Wu grinned, remarking on the adage that a fine sword is destined for a hero. Given that the esteemed Mr. Che's character was befitting of such a sword, Bai Wu, as a subordinate, aspired to offer it to him as a token of his respect. However, Yong Kong requested the main character to refrain from excessive praise. If he successfully marketed that sword to specific global purchasers, it would likely attain an exceedingly high value. Bai Wu underscored that in the realm of antiquities, the crucial aspect was identifying the appropriate custodian. Such a gem was destined for Yong Kong, hence the main character would refuse to part with it to anyone else, regardless of the amount offered. Yong Kong gazed at him and positioned the blade upon the surface, suggesting that they ought to consume tea. Bai Wu became aware that something was amiss and inquired whether it was conceivable that Yong Kong was displeased with the sword or possibly dissatisfied with the protagonist himself. The system indicated that his contentment with the sword was at a perfect 100%. 100%, whereas his contentment with the protagonist was merely 10%. Yongkong elaborated that the present was overly valuable, thus he hesitated to receive it. Furthermore, in forming friendships, he esteemed integrity and capability above the worth of a present. As a result, he preferred to nurture their camaraderie in a chivalrous fashion. The main character was taken aback, believing that this constituted a straightforward dismissal of him, and judging by the expression, he was deemed unworthy of being Yongkong's companion. The system indicated that he genuinely lacked the credentials for that. Yongkong highlighted that the blade was an excellent piece with a market valuation of 5 million, thus he was willing to offer that amount. He presented the check to the main character, stating that should he come across any worthwhile item in the future, he could take it there, as he would not treat him unjustly. Bai Wu came to understand that the elderly gentleman was a prominent player in the sector, likely perceiving Bai Wu as a sycophant, attempting to ingratiate himself by presenting a blade as Liu Bei's. And now, this old man had become all the more intriguing. Therefore, if the main character did not demonstrate genuine skill, he would be unable to gain his favor. He gazed out the window, conceived a thought, and remarked that commerce was genuinely commerce. Furthermore, if Mr. Qi genuinely wished to acquire that blade, then that valuation was incorrect. Yongkong inquired about the protagonist's intention behind that statement. Bai Wu underscored that the elderly gentleman had just stated that if it truly was a blade wielded by Liu Bei, its worth would be 50 million. Yongkong inquired if Bai Wu was genuinely convinced that the blade had been wielded by the Duke. Bai Wu started sipping his tea and replied affirmatively, inquiring if Yongkong had ever been intrigued by how, at the protagonist's age, he was able to instantly recognize authentic articles. Elder Che remarked that the main character truly possessed insightful eyes and inquired whether it was conceivable that he had a familial legacy of scholarship. The main character clarified that, to be utterly candid, he possessed some familial knowledge, yet it pertained not to the evaluation of antiques, but instead to the practice of divination. Yongkong pondered if he was genuinely proficient in the I Ching and whether all the relics had been unearthed via divination. The main character remarked that this was precisely accurate, asserting that it encompassed not only antiques but various other items as well. To substantiate his claim, he could mention that Xiao Xiao was concealed outside the window. Yongkong was astonished by this, and the central character believed that it was now Xiao Xiao's responsibility to topple her own grandfather. Xiao Xiao was indeed perched outside the window, asserting that the main character, that rogue, would likely attempt to trick her grandfather once more. Consequently, she had to listen to what they were discussing within. The moment she thrust her head through the window, her grandfather was gazing intently at her. Bai Wu reflected that, luckily, he had utilized the system to verify her whereabouts previously. Xiao Xiao was astonished to encounter her grandfather. The main character ridiculed the predicament, stating that he was unaware of her arachnid-like powers. Xiao Xiao grew increasingly vexed, questioning how he could possibly jest in such circumstances. She warned him that if he persisted, she would demonstrate how a young woman could deliver a valuable lesson. Her grandfather's frustration mounted, and she acknowledged that she was already aware of her misstep. She then leaped from the window, expressing her intention to return home and contemplate at once. Bai Wu inquired whether Yongkong presently held the belief that he possessed the ability to foretell events. However, the elderly gentleman suggested that perhaps the main character had simply perceived something beyond the window and inferred that it was her. Thus, this alone was insufficient to convince him that Bai Wu possessed all-encompassing knowledge. The main character believed that this elderly gentleman was truly challenging to manage, and chose to inquire what would be required to convince him of that narrative. Yongkong remarked that if the main character were truly all-knowing and capable of perceiving and forecasting events, then he ought not to pose that question. Bai Wu sensed that he was being outmaneuvered by the elderly gentleman, and if he did not swiftly devise a means to convince him, he would forfeit the opportunity for collaboration. He inquired of the system the likelihood of persuading the elderly gentleman. The system cautioned that the likelihood was 87.25%. Bai Wu was astonished by such an elevated success rate, yet remained uncertain about what actions he should take. After contemplating for some time, he ultimately realized which direction he ought to pursue. He inquired of the system whether disclosing the genuine origins of all the artifacts within that chamber would be sufficient to convince the elderly gentleman. The system indicated that he was accurate, and the likelihood was absolute at 100%. Bai Wu underscored that he had been watching attentively and that there were precisely 26 historic artifacts within that chamber. However, the elderly gentleman stressed that recognizing 26 relics in that space merely indicated that the protagonist possessed counting skills, and it did not substantiate his ability to genuinely perceive the unseen. Bai Wu interjected the elderly gentleman and requested that he attentively pay attention. Yongkong expressed his readiness to hear. The main character grinned, observing that the elderly gentleman remained quite composed, yet would soon be astonished astonished in mere moments. He commanded the system to initiate the procedure and swiftly recognized all of the objects available. Bai Wu stated that the collection of rosewood furnishings originated from the Qianlong period of the Qing dynasty. Yong Kong remarked that he had performed rather well. Bai Wu underscored that it ought to be regal furnishings valued at approximately 20 million and inquired if he was correct in that assessment. The elderly gentleman asserted that he was undeniably accurate, yet to persuade him that remained insufficient. Bai Wu grasped a rock in his palm and stated that it was an exceptional black jade inkstone, a piece originating from the Wanli era of the Ming dynasty, appraised at approximately 5 million. The elderly gentleman maintained his composure and asserted that he was correct. The main character highlighted that this black jade inkstone ought to have been utilized by Zhang Juzang, the chief secretary during the Wanli era of the Ming dynasty. This astonished the elderly gentleman. He rose swiftly and inquired of the protagonist how he was aware of that, as the senior authorities had dedicated 2 entire years examining numerous historical documents before validating the provenance of that inkstone. Bai Wu chuckled and remarked that he had indeed delineated it. Yong Kong continued to be astonished, pondering how such a thing could occur. The main character simply grinned and remarked that, judging by appearances, he required first-hand experience to be convinced, thus he merely needed to observe with patience. Yong Kong expressed his regrets, admitting that he had lost his calm and requested the main character to proceed. Bai Wu noted that the brush holder was an artifact from the imperial study of Emperor Jiaqing of the Qing dynasty, while the brushes originated from the Republic of China period. That bronze wine vessel originated from the state of Song during the spring and autumn era. The blue and white ceramics originated from the Hu Tian furnace of Jingdezhen during the Yuan dynasty. Yong Kong was genuinely astonished by everything that transpired, and the main character underscored that he had detailed the provenance of all 26 relics, inquiring if there were still any uncertainties regarding his competence. The elderly gentleman spoke no further, for had he not witnessed it firsthand, he would have doubted its existence entirely. Bai Wu inquires whether he now trusts him after he mentioned that the sword had been wielded by Liu Bei. The elderly gentleman remarked that the central figure was truly a celestial mathematician, and for this reason, he warranted reverence. He stressed that he had already authenticated the ancestry and provenance of the artifacts in that chamber. Nevertheless, he was unable to ascertain whether that blade had genuinely been wielded by the Duke, asserting that the Duke's usage of it, based solely on the protagonist's inference, appeared somewhat excessively enchanted. Bai Wu was taken aback by this response, and sensed that, judging by his expression, the elderly gentleman remained skeptical of his claims. Nevertheless, the system asserted that this was false, highlighting that the elderly gentleman had complete faith in the protagonist. Bai Wu felt perplexed, for if the old man had such faith, why was he still disputing the matter? Perhaps this was merely a taunt, or perhaps it stemmed from a necessity for assistance that the protagonist could provide. The system indicated a full score for that inquiry. Bai Wu regarded the elderly gentleman as impressive, having just managed to gain his favor, yet with a scowl, the old man was once more employing the 36 stratagems against him. However, such behavior was anticipated from a prominent figure within the field, a genuine expert in understanding human behavior. He inquired of the system whether, seemingly, the elderly gentleman had a particular thought in mind and wondered if it could be that object. The system affirmed that was accurate. The protagonist repeated the question, asking if the concern the old man had pertained to collectibles, to which the system responded affirmatively. Bai Wu inquired if there was an object that the elderly gentleman was unable to evaluate, and for that reason, sought the protagonist's assessment. The system underscored that this was entirely accurate. The main character chuckled and inquired of Mr. Che whether there was any object he wished him to evaluate. Yong Kong was astonished once more, inquiring how he had uncovered that. Friends, if you appreciated the clip, give a thumbs up, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to ensure you stay updated with fresh content. I appreciate it.